If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 21. Scores are not important. Cassen felt a bit awkward under Dumbledore's praise. Are you buttering me up because you have some impossible task for me? Dumbledore shook his head with a smile. No, truly. That was just an honest reflection. Now go send your letter. I'm off to the kitchen to see if the house elves might prepare a little something special. Cassen shrugged, heading into the Olary. He quickly sent off the letter and then strolled back to the castle. Returning to his office, he casually pulled out one of his many mysterious blocks and tapped it lightly. Instantly, a cascade of positive emotional notifications flooded his view. Cassen sighed. Ever since he'd started teaching, these emotional pings ranging from admiration to a few awkward crushes had become a regular thing during classes. Once, while lecturing, a particularly pink-hued notification about a love-struck student had caught him off guard and nearly caused him to lose his train of thought. From then on, he'd started turning them off during lessons. Of course, sometimes he forgot to toggle the settings back, but hey, nobody's perfect. As the day's classes wound down, Cassen decided to reward himself with a fresh cup of green tea. Just as he began preparing it, a knock sounded at his office door. Come in. It's open, he called out. The door creaked open, and in walked a small figure, Neville. Cassen raised an eyebrow in curiosity, only to notice that Neville wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 other students. 2 boys and 1 girl. And among them? A familiar face, Harry Potter. The other 2. Come on in. By the looks of it, you're all friends. Neville nodded enthusiastically. Congratulations, Neville. And congratulations to all of you, you've made a wonderful friend, Cassen said warmly. He pulled out 4 additional cups and poured green tea for everyone. Professor, let me introduce you, Neville said, beaming. This is Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger, my 3 friends. Have some tea. It might be a bit bitter, Cassen warned, smiling as he waved his wand. The teapot floated from his desk to a side table. After all, talking to students across a desk always felt too much like a lecture. A cozy conversation on the sofas felt far more welcoming. Today, Malfoy came to mess with me again, Neville began, his excitement palpable. I used the levitation charm to lift him into the air, then dropped him hard onto the ground. His 2 lackeys tried to rush me using their fists, mind you, but Harry and Ron showed up just in time. They helped me chase off Malfoy. Then Malfoy said he was going to tell Professor Snape, Neville continued, and we didn't know what to do. That's when we ran into Hermione. She suggested we come to you. And besides, he added, his face glowing, I wanted to tell you I stood up for myself. Sitting on the sofa, his face flushed with excitement, Neville waved his hands animatedly as he recounted the events. See? Cassen said, nodding in approval. You've taken a brave first step and found loyal, reliable friends along the way. Neville's already flushed face grew even redder with excitement at Cassen's words of affirmation. Meanwhile, Harry and Ron, hearing themselves described as loyal and reliable friends, looked a little bashful. Hermione, however, stayed focused on the reason they'd all come in the first place. Professor Cassen, Hermione began, Malfoy said he's going to tell Snape. He's sure to drag Neville in front of him and have Gryffindor docked a ton of points. So? Let him dock them, Cassen replied nonchalantly. Didn't Professor McGonagall deduct points from Slytherin last time? What's the big deal? But... Professor, Gryffindor's points. Hermione protested. Gryffindor's points really aren't the important thing here, Cassen said, waving it off. What matters is that Neville won't ever again be the pushover he used to be. As for the points? Just think of it as giving Snape a little something to keep him happy. How about that? Hermione shook her head resolutely. No, how about that? The fact is, Malfoy was the one in the wrong here. And yet, in the end, it's Gryffindor that gets punished? It's unfair. You might not know this, Cassen began, but when I was younger, I went to school in the Muggle world. From a local community primary school all the way to the University of Manchester, the general consensus among students was that conflicts between kids should be solved by the kids themselves. Telling the teacher the usual approach rarely solved anything. Often, the wrongdoer didn't face any real consequences, while the victim got retaliated against. The only method that ever worked was to settle things head-on with your fists, Cassen explained. Professor, I don't quite understand, Hermione admitted, looking a little uncomfortable. On the surface, Cassen clarified, I'm encouraging Neville to fight back. But what I'm also saying is, don't be afraid of losing points. Why should someone like Malfoy, who's in the wrong, not fear losing points, while Neville who's done nothing wrong should? Should anyone just stand there and let others point a wand or a gun at them? Cassen spread his hands and said it plainly. Harry and Ron exchanged a glance, nodding in agreement, while Neville had already taken Cassen's words as absolute truth. Only Hermione seemed uneasy. But, the points. Points don't matter, Cassen said, waving dismissively. They're nothing more than an intangible concept of so-called honor. If that kind of honor makes a young wizard feel bound, unable to fight back his bullies, then that honor is better off being discarded. That's absolutely right, Professor. Neville finally burst out, unable to contain himself. Cassen agreed with a satisfied nod. Even Professor McGonagall will be glad to know you stood up for yourself. This whole matter? At most, you'll lose 10 or 20 points. Maybe Snape will dock you more, but who cares? It'll pass. Look at the Weasley twins George and Fred, Ron's brothers. They lose 10 or 20 points nearly every day, and they're doing just fine. I'll remember that, Professor. Neville said, nodding firmly. After seeing the 4 little kids out, Cassen once again found himself with some free time. Well, not exactly free time. A shimmering, silver phoenix suddenly appeared in his office, its ethereal form glowing faintly. The phoenix spoke in a calm, clear voice, Professor Cassen, please come to the 3rd floor corridor, the area I mentioned as off-limits at the start of the school year. Dumbledore's voice? What a fascinating bit of magic. Cassen stood up with a sigh, reluctantly leaving his office. He had no idea what task Dumbledore might have in store for him this time. When he arrived at the corridor, he realized he wasn't the only one summoned. Nearly all the professors responsible for core subjects were there, along with Hagrid. The large man was holding onto one head, no, 3, let's just call it 1. He was holding onto a massive 3-headed dog, doing his best to calm the enormous creature. I've called you here to assist me in setting up protections. I need to safeguard something precious, the Philosopher's Stone entrusted to me by Nicolas Flamel. From his pocket, Dumbledore produced a blood-red gemstone. Cassen noticed that Quirrell's gaze lingered on the stone with an unsettling intensity. Plus 10 satisfaction from Quirrell. Plus 10 satisfaction from Voldemort. Chapter 22 Dragon Quest? It seemed like the two of them were quite satisfied by the Philosopher's Stone in Dumbledore's hand. After all, the real Philosopher's Stone and the fake Philosopher's Stone Kasenhis had created for him were nearly identical in appearance, color, and even the magical aura they emitted. What a terrifying talent! Quirrell's gaze at Kasenhis was filled with astonishment. I need your help to design obstacles to protect this stone. However, we need to leave a way through after all. I don't want the entire school in an uproar when it's time to retrieve the Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore said with a smile. And no problem, but I'm not ready. I haven't prepared anything. Quirrell stammered nervously. It's fine, there's no rush just yet. Others can set up their parts first, of course, working from the inside out. At that moment, Dumbledore snapped his fingers. Chirp! A wave of overwhelming fire engulfed everyone, and in the blink of an eye, they found themselves in a room. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal. Dumbledore placed the Philosopher's Stone on it. Please begin. Who wants to go first? Dumbledore turned to look at everyone. Kasenhis noticed that none of the other professors were speaking, so he shrugged. I'll go. Professor Cassen, just to make sure you heard me clearly earlier, I'll reiterate, your designed obstacle must include a way for us to bypass it if needed, Dumbledore added. Fine, Kasenhis, who really didn't listen carefully just now, gave up the idea of burying TNT in Hogwarts. Instead, he casually arranged some obsidian to create a concealed piston door, connecting it with a redstone circuit that he ran up a nearby wall. Kasenhis set up an entire wall of levers, with a concealed dispenser at the top. Only one lever was connected to the piston door, while all the others were linked to the dispenser. Professor Snape, fill the dispenser with some harmless potions. Snape nodded. I assure you, it will make any intruder sleep for an entire day. The other professors then set up their respective challenges, Snape's logical potion riddle, Professor McGonagall's oversized wizard's chess, the flying keys with a magical door, the devil's snare, and finally, Hagrid's enormous three-headed dog. As Kasenhis walked through the sequence of obstacles from the inside out, he confirmed his suspicions. Hagrid's section was the most straightforwardly dangerous, clearly designed to eliminate intruders. The rest of the challenges were either laughably easy or had negligible consequences. It's Hagrid. How about saying he is sincere? After all this was done, Cassen was about to return to the office and lie down. However, he was quietly summoned to Dumbledore's office. Cassen, that piston door, is that what it's called? Dumbledore asked, pulling out a large box of snacks from his drawer, every single one of them sweets. Yes, Kasenhis replied with a nod. What's the correct way to open it? Dumbledore took out a large box of snacks from the drawer, and they were all sweet. The way Dumbledore paired his question with his actions made him look just like a little wizard holding a lot of snacks as a bribe, asking him for a random test topic in the next class. Well, actually I don't know. When I arranged the lines, I arranged them casually. Dumbledore looked at Cassen with his sincere eyes. Well, that magic circuit is the same as the red stone I used to make the fake magic stone for you. As long as the fake magic stone touches the magic circuit casually, the door will open. Cassen couldn't resist Dumbledore's weirdness. In this case, I also need a piece of red stone made by you. Dumbledore said. Who needs it? It's definitely not you. I remember you were able to apparate inside Hogwarts. For Harry Potter. You really want an 11-year-old kid to play Dragon Quest? That's extreme even for you, Kasenhis shot back immediately, not holding back. Harry is famous now, but he still needs real achievements. This will give him something real to his name, just like how you pass down your alchemical achievements to your students, Dumbledore explained. That's different. Besides, why does Harry need achievements? Why does he need more fame? For an 11-year-old, those are burdens, not blessings. He can't handle all that pressure. Dumbledore crossed his hands on his desk, pausing thoughtfully before responding. This is tied to a prophecy made by Sybil Trelawney, our divination professor. Ha! Although this is a magical world, I still have to say that it is really surprising that a wise man like you believes in prophecies. Cassen said sarcastically. I don't place blind faith in prophecies, but I do respect them, Dumbledore replied calmly. This is about whether we can truly destroy Tom, defeat Voldemort. I must account for every possibility and try every conceivable method to kill him. Voldemort's vitality is far too tenacious. Once, the entire wizarding world believed him to be dead, yet he reappeared boldly, no less on the back of Quirrell's head. I cannot afford a single mistake. So, even trusting in something as nebulous as a prophecy. Even if it's a prophecy, Dumbledore affirmed with a nod. Here. Kasenhis conjured a thumb-sized redstone block into his hand and placed it on Dumbledore's desk. You can find a chance to give it to Harry. No, I think it's better if you give it to him, Dumbledore said, pushing the redstone back toward Kasenhis. By the way, tell him what it is like. Otherwise, he might end up holding this little thing and still be clueless in front of your piston door. Life is truly difficult, Kasenhis muttered, waving his hand to destroy the redstone block as he sighed. Oh, and if Quirrell asks you how to open that piston door, answer him in a way that's both subtle and ensures you won't remember telling him, Dumbledore added as an afterthought. I got fucked up the last time I drank. It seems that I am about to break the habit. Kasenhis lamented, pulling a pained expression. Life is short, enjoy yourself in the moment. There is nothing wrong with drinking. You just picked the wrong partner. I believe there are not many people who can drink as happily as Hagrid. If you managed to drink with him like that and were still alive, you are already a rare drinker. Dumbledore consoled. That's right. Who can drink on an equal footing with a giant? I'm so awesome. Dumbledore calmed down Cassen's mental internal conflict with a few words, and watched him happily walk out of the headmaster's office, heading towards Hagrid's hut to continue the fight with Hagrid. Meanwhile, the fine wine Dumbledore had painstakingly unearthed from his old family stash would now have to wait until Kasenhis recovered from his next bout of drinking. What a pity, indeed. Chapter 23 Hogshead Inn. Hey, Hagrid. I knew you'd be here. Kasenhis greeted, spotting Hagrid fertilizing his pumpkins. Professor Cassen. How's teaching? Are the little wizards giving you trouble? Hagrid straightened up, waving cheerfully. Not at all. Honestly, the students who take my alchemy class are quite well behaved. By the way, are you free today? So, honestly, we should have just had drinks at your place. This place is filthy. At the Hogshead Inn, Kasenhis frowned, wiping the counter repeatedly with a handkerchief. As for his glass, he had brought his own. Don't mind the details. Drinking here has a certain charm, and we can drink to our heart's content without worrying about trouble. The owner of this place is a terrifyingly skilled wizard. No one dares mess with him, Hagrid reassured. Fine, fine. After a few drinks, I'll forget about it anyway. Kasenhis poured whiskey into his cup, clinked glasses with Hagrid, and took a hearty swig. Hey? Doesn't feel like last time's woozy sensation. Looks like I've improved quite a bit in terms of alcohol tolerance, Kasenhis muttered. Of course. Usually, I don't even get warmed up before the others are flat on the floor. You're the only one who can hold their own against me. Though, didn't you say last time, if I drink again, I'm a dog? Hagrid scratched his head. Oh. Did I say that? Hagrid's eyes darted around. No, you didn't. Must have been my mistake. Now that's more like it. Kasenhis clinked his glass with Hagrid again. This time, however, he was beginning to feel the telltale signs of dizziness. Gradually, he lost count of how many bottles of whiskey were on their table. Of course, it wasn't just whiskey, an assortment of distilled spirits like vodka, gin, brandy, and tequila cluttered the table between them. Naturally, the floor around them was cluttered too. A figure in a black cloak, their face obscured, carefully chose where to step before finally settling into a seat. Mind if I join you for a drink? The hooded person asked in a low voice. Very. Heek. Much so, Kasenhis replied, shaking his head. Well then, how about a wager? I've got something worth betting. Take a look at this big guy. A dragon egg I won off someone else. At the mention of a dragon egg, Hagrid, who had been dozing off in a stupor, suddenly perked up. Though not completely, he was much more alert. What do you want to bet on? Hagrid yelled in excitement. Well, I actually know who you are, Hagrid, the gamekeeper of Hogwarts. I've heard you have a great deal of expertise with magical creatures. Coincidentally, I've got a three-headed dog, but it's far too excitable. I want to know how to calm it down. If your advice works, this dragon egg is yours, the cloaked figure proposed. That's easy. Three-headed dogs love music. Just play some soothing tunes, and it'll settle down, maybe even fall asleep. I'd recommend a harp. They seem especially fond of that kind of music, Hagrid said eagerly. Kasenhis leaned against his bottle, watching the cloaked figure. For some reason, something felt off about them. But the alcohol clouding his brain made it hard to pinpoint what exactly was wrong. Oh well, who cares? Kasenhis poured himself another glass of whiskey, gulping it down. Meanwhile, the cloaked figure handed the dragon egg to Hagrid and then turned their attention to Kasenhis, who was visibly tipsy and barely coherent. Professor Kasenhis, the figure began in a soft, measured tone, you've been making waves recently. I've heard about some of your remarkable alchemical creations using that red stone you crafted. Kasenhis hiccuped and pondered for a moment. Right, he had indeed used redstone to make Snape an upgraded alchemical stove. Yeah, Heek. That's true. What about Heek? Don't get me wrong. This is just a small request, the figure continued smoothly. Based on the redstone theory you taught in the 4th year class, I attempted to create a small device myself. But I seem to have made a mistake in wiring, and now I can't tell which switch is the correct one. What should I do? Where'd you get redstone from? Kasenhis asked, squinting at the figure. A 4th year student gave it to me, the figure explained. They said it was an alchemical creation from their professor and that I should treasure it. Ah, I see. Well, just cut the main redstone circuit and reconnect it to a redstone block. Heek. Problem solved, Kasenhis replied. Is it that simple? Haven't you studied runes? The logic is pretty much the same, Kasenhis said with a shrug, his tone intoxicated. But, isn't this situation a little suspicious? As his muddled brain started piecing things together, Kasenhis realized who this cloaked figure probably was. If it had just been a question about the three-headed dog, maybe it could have been a coincidence, he thought. But of all the things, the figure just had to also ask about redstone. A three-headed dog plus redstone? There was no way Kasenhis believed in such coincidences. The conclusion was clear, this cloaked person was almost certainly Quirrell. Well, that worked out perfectly. Ha ha ha. Dumbledore had asked him to subtly reveal the method for bypassing the piston door to Quirrell. Kasenhis had been pondering how to deliver that information. And now, as if by fate, the opportunity presented itself. Thank you both. Oh, and Hagrid, here's the dragon egg for you, said the cloaked man Quirrell, leaving the dragon egg on the table before departing the Hogshead Inn. Haha, Professor Cassen. Who would have thought we'd get such a big surprise while just having a drink? A dragon egg. Haha. Hagrid chuckled, cradling the egg in his massive arms. Then he turned to see Kasenhis still pouring drink after drink into himself, and his laughter faded. Am I overdoing it a bit? What do you think? Ah, my bad, my bad. Come on, cheers. The next day. That'll be 29 galleons and 6 sickles. Tell you what, I'll round it up, make it 30 galleons even, said the goat-bearded old bartender in an utterly indifferent tone. Kasenhis froze mid-motion, hand reaching for his coin pouch, stunned by the sheer audacity of rounding up. Still, he didn't protest. After all, he and Hagrid had spent the entire night passed out in the inn, monopolizing a table until morning. They had indeed disrupted the bar's business. And despite spending an entire night in the bustling, crowded tavern, neither Kasenhis nor Hagrid had lost anything, not the dragon egg, nor their galleons. With security measures this thorough, tipping an extra galleon hardly seemed unreasonable. 30 galleons. Care to count them? Kasenhis laid out 30 galleons neatly on the counter. No need, the old bartender replied, scooping up the coins in one fluid motion before retreating to his spot behind the bar, where he resumed cleaning a filthy glass with an equally filthy rag. Chapter 24 Erised Desire. As soon as they stepped out of the tavern, Hagrid couldn't contain himself any longer. He grabbed Kasenhis by the shoulders and began shaking him enthusiastically. Cassen! Professor Cassen! Do you know what this is? A dragon egg! A dragon egg! I've always wanted to raise a dragon, always. A dragon, can you believe it? Okay, okay, a dragon, a dragon. I get it. I get it. Kasenhis responded, utterly resigned as Hagrid continued shaking him like a rag doll. Right then. I'm heading straight to my hut. I can't wait to start hatching this beautiful creature. Oh, and Professor Cassen, could you do me a favor? Swing by the library and grab some books on dragons? Stuff on hatching, raising them, and maybe something on identifying dragon species. Still clutching the egg, Hagrid spun circles around Cassen in his excitement, nearly undoing the man's already tenuous grasp on consciousness. Fine, fine, I'll do it. Just stop spinning around, Hagrid. I'm begging you, Cassen muttered, trying to steady himself. By the time they returned to Hogwarts, the two of them looked more suspicious than they had any right to be. Hagrid sneaked off to his hut with the dragon egg held like a precious gem, while Cassen stumbled his way back into the castle, groggy and bleary-eyed. His first stop was the headmaster's office. Upon seeing Cassen, Dumbledore's face lit up with excitement, and he eagerly waved him over. You really must see this, Dumbledore said, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. He stood up from his desk, grabbed Cassen's arm, and led him to one corner of the office. There stood an ornate, resplendent mirror. What do you see? Dumbledore asked, his voice filled with intrigue. I renovated Hogwarts from the inside out with one block after another, Kasenhis blurted out instinctively. Dumbledore, standing beside him, gave him a look so warm and friendly that it bordered on unsettling. I must say, Cassen, if we were to put the sorting hat on you, you'd undoubtedly be sorted into Hufflepuff, Dumbledore said with conviction. Why Hufflepuff? Kasenhis asked, raising an eyebrow. Because even your deepest desires are so simple and comforting. I can't imagine you fitting into any other house. Desires. Dumbledore nodded. Exactly, desires. This is the mirror of erised. It reflects the deepest yearnings of one's heart. But with something as charming as your vision, I'd rather call it a dream than a desire. And to be honest, I've never stopped you from remodeling Hogwarts. If anything, I sincerely hope you'd start with the headmaster's office, Dumbledore added, a playful smile tugging at his lips. Cassen tapped his knuckles against the mirror, watching his reflection mimic the motion. The version of him in the mirror even gave him a polite salute back. Well, that'll have to wait until I have some free time. Honestly, teaching students isn't exactly a walk in the park, Cassen replied. Understandable, Dumbledore said. Now, I need to move this mirror to another room. Care to join me? Are we doing this by hand? Of course, we'll use magic, Dumbledore replied, placing one hand on Kasenhis' shoulder and the other on the edge of the mirror. With a resonating hum, the pair, along with the mirror, vanished from the headmaster's office and reappeared in an empty classroom. Harry will like this gift, Dumbledore said, gently setting the mirror in place. But I don't intend to give it to him. I only want him to experience it. When will you let him experience it? Honestly, why not just let him use it in your office? After Christmas. I don't want to get too close to him too soon. It's not the right time yet. Ah, Christmas. You've just reminded me I haven't prepared any Christmas gifts yet, Kasenhis suddenly shivered as if realizing the weight of his oversight. And who do you plan to give gifts to? Dumbledore asked with a knowing smile. Everyone at Hogwarts. Neville, Harry, and their friends, of course. My students as well. The twins love pranks, so I'm thinking of making them a gadget that can send people flying harmlessly, of course. George might like a new Quidditch robe, and Angelina mentioned her broomstick is uncomfortable to ride, then there's Cedric, and Kasenhis continued, rattling off names and ideas, his enthusiasm uncontainable. Dumbledore watched him with a warm smile, his eyes twinkling. Cassen, I must say, you are truly full of love. Love? Maybe. Kasenhis shrugged, his expression nonchalant. Honestly, I haven't met my mother yet. But I can feel that she lived well. Death is but the next great adventure, Cassen. I'm sure she is doing well in whatever world her soul is right now. Kasenhis felt a little awkward. He couldn't exactly tell Dumbledore that she really was in another world, even though the headmaster's perception wasn't too far off. Oh well, no need to dwell on it. By the way, almost forgot I was drinking with Hagrid at the Hog's Head when a hooded figure managed to coax out the method to calm the three-headed dog through a bet with Hagrid. I suspect it was Quirrell, so I also told him how to open the piston door. Ah, how considerate of you. Saves trouble all around, not just for you, but for Quirrell and Tom as well, Dumbledore replied with a smile. Maybe. Anything else you need? If not, I'll be on my way. Kasenhis asked. Nothing else, but remember to share the method to open the piston door with Harry. Those four caused quite the commotion during today's flying lesson, nearly giving Madame Hooch and Minerva heart attacks. And poor Mr. Malfoy. He ended up being hung from a tree by Mr. Longbottom's levitation spell. Just as Mr. Malfoy had hung Mr. Longbottom's Remembrall in a tree barely 2 minutes earlier, Dumbledore added with a chuckle. Kasenhis smirked, his expression unmistakably amused. Well, petty skirmishes between young wizards are pretty normal, especially when they're evenly matched. Indeed. And it's good news on two fronts. Poor Mr. Longbottom, bolstered by the support of his beloved professor, has regained his confidence and begun standing up to other students' bullying. And Harry, during this little escapade, showcased extraordinary flying talent. I must say, he'll make an excellent seeker just like his father. When Dumbledore spoke about such delightful events, his face naturally lit up with a smile. It reminded Kasenhis of his junior high homeroom teacher, a petite and kind-hearted elderly lady. Her face was always adorned with a smile, revealing her front teeth so gentle, so compassionate. And wise. Well, I suppose I should congratulate them then. That's not all I wanted to mention, Dumbledore continued. What I really wanted to tell you is that they're likely headed to your office. Mr. Longbottom is very eager for your approval and praise. Right now, Harry has just left Minerva's office and is probably on his way to yours. Oh, is that so? Do I still have time to get there first? I imagine Mr. Longbottom would be more than willing to wait for you even past curfew, risking being caught for wandering after hours, Dumbledore replied with a twinkle in his eye. Looks like I'd better hurry back then. I truly wish you had been one of my own students, though I may not have been the most adept teacher for you, Dumbledore added as he adjusted his glasses. I'll take that as a compliment, Kasenhis shrugged and stepped out of the empty classroom. Chapter 25 Great Hall and Snape. Kasenhis didn't hesitate to use ender pearls in the corridor, and within just a few breaths, he had arrived on the same floor as his office. The four little ones were sitting off to the side near his office, chattering about something. What are you all doing here in the corridor? Kasenhis called out to them playfully. Professor Cassen, we came to, Haha, never mind, honestly, I'm happy to have you visit. Come on in, Kasenhis said, waving them toward the door as he opened it and ushered them inside. He pulled out snacks and drinks from the cabinet and set them on the coffee table. He hadn't forgotten Dumbledore's earlier advice. Please wait a moment while I finish working on this. Of course, you're welcome to take a look if you are interested. In third year, you'll start choosing elective courses. Perhaps you'd like to try alchemy, he suggested. Putting on an air of focus, Kasenhis retrieved a massive redstone lamp block from under his desk. With calculated brutality, he dismantled its casing and began tinkering with the myriad of redstone circuits inside. As expected, the four little ones quickly gathered around, their curiosity piqued. Why doesn't this type of alchemy rely on runes? Hermione asked, her voice brimming with interest. Ever heard of an enchanting table? I prefer letting the enchanting table's effects replace the function of runes. It's more stable and durable, Kasenhis explained while dismantling the redstone lamp. And what are these thin red strands? Hermione asked again, her curiosity unrelenting. Kasenhis was quite pleased with Hermione's enthusiasm. He held up a piece of redstone in his hand. This is an alchemical material I created myself. I call it redstone. It's a magical energy crystal that can partially substitute for magical circuits. The issue with this redstone lamp is simple. There's a break in the redstone circuit. That's one advantage redstone circuits have over regular magical circuits. If this were a magical lamp, it would have exploded by now, Kasenhis added with a sly grin. Can this lamp still be fixed? Ron leaned in, intrigued. Of course, it's simple. All you need to do is find where the circuit is broken and reconnect it. When redstone touches a redstone circuit, the circuit will light up. Sometimes, when I build large redstone mechanisms with complex switches, and I don't feel like following the sequence, I just dismantle the casing like this, Kasenhis said as he stuck a small piece of redstone to a broken section of the redstone line closest to the lamp. But wouldn't this kind of redstone alchemy be easily damaged? Hermione asked, ever the critical thinker. That's why you add a casing. Oh, makes sense, Hermione said, feeling slightly embarrassed. Exactly. Kasenhis quickly fixed the redstone lamp he had just dismantled, then turned his attention to the group. I'm guessing you all have some news to share with me. At this, Neville's excitement overflowed immediately. During flying lessons today, that Malfoy still hadn't learned his lesson and tried to bother me again. I taught him a real lesson. He put my Remembrall up in a tree, so I put him up in a tree. Neville's face flushed with excitement as he spoke, looking every bit like a brave hero who had just vanquished a dragon. That's great, Neville. And I can tell you've regained your confidence. Believe me, when you go home for Christmas, your gran will be astonished by how much you've changed, Kasenhis said with a smile. Really? She will? Neville asked, his eyes sparkling with hope. Absolutely, Kasenhis replied firmly, leaving no room for doubt. He also made a mental note to write a letter to Neville's grandmother. Purely oppressive education methods were unacceptable. And another thing, Harry successfully joined the Quidditch team. He's the youngest seeker since the school was founded, personally approved by Professor McGonagall. Neville continued sharing with Kasenhis, his enthusiasm making it clear that he could go on for hours about the day's events. By the time the sun started to turn golden, the four students finally realized just how long they had been there. It was definitely time to leave. Oh, before you go, here's a small gift. I hope you don't mind. Maybe you can use this to make something interesting, Kasenhis said, waving his hand. 4 fist-sized redstone cubes appeared on the coffee table. Thank you, Professor. X4. Off you go. And although it might sound a little cliché, make sure to study well, Kasenhis said with a stretch as he loosened his joints before leaving the office and heading toward the Great Hall. He'd heard there was lamb chops on the menu tonight. How could he not go and sample them? Unlike events like the opening feast or Halloween feast, where all the professors typically attended, regular meals often had an inconsistent lineup of staff present. Today, though, Kasenhis was surprised to see the usually elusive Professor Snape at the staff table. Good evening, Severus, though I suppose that greeting might sound a bit odd. Snape shook his head. I've encountered odder greetings. He glanced up and down the staff table to make sure no one was paying attention, particularly noting the vacant spot that should have been Quirrell's. After a moment of consideration, he asked, Did Dumbledore tell you about Quirrell? Not exactly. I figured it out on my own, Kasenhis replied. Snape nodded slightly. You're perceptive. The other day, I was in Hogsmeade picking up some potion ingredients when I saw you and Hagrid at the Hog's Head, drunk out of your minds. There was a man in black who seemed to be probing you both. Who was he? I couldn't see his face clearly, but I'm pretty sure it was Quirrell. He was asking Hagrid about the three-headed dog and me about how to get past the piston door. Did he come to you? No. A simple logic test like mine wouldn't require him to ask. If it did, he should seriously consider checking himself into St. Mungo's for a thorough evaluation, Snape replied with an unmistakable disdain for Quirrell in his tone. Yeah, fair point, Kasenhis trailed off mid-sentence. Dumbledore trusts me. He's told me that if necessary, I should give Quirrell a nudge in the right direction, tell him the correct answers, Snape explained, noticing Kasenhis's hesitation. It's not that I have much of an opinion about Quirrell or Voldemort, for that matter. He's just another powerful and evil dark wizard. But Dumbledore's faith in that prophecy? That's something else. I'm new here, but honestly, does he really believe a child like Harry can defeat Voldemort? Prophecies, sometimes, they deserve a degree of reverence. Cassen was a little confused as to how to continue the topic, so he could only say dryly, I always thought potions were a materialistic subject. It's not true. Snape was about to explain when he was interrupted by a commotion in the classroom below. Chapter 26 The dog is still alive, right? Before Snape could say more, voices erupted from below. By the way, what's going on down there? They are talking about a midnight duel between Slytherin and Gryffindor. Nothing worth watching, Snape replied coldly. At this point, Kasenhis directed his gaze toward the source of the commotion. Unfortunately, the distance was too great to catch any of the words being exchanged. Both sides had familiar faces. On Gryffindor's team were Harry, Neville, Ron, and Hermione. Kasenhis had thought, based on his earlier conversations with Harry and Neville, that their relationship with Hermione wasn't particularly strong. But it seemed like things had improved after Hermione helped Neville by suggesting they go to his office that time. On the Slytherin side, the leader was Draco Malfoy. The other two students, Kasenhis didn't recognize. Speaking of Draco Malfoy, his father, Lucius Malfoy, exuded a certain refined restraint and aloofness that screamed upper class. But his son? Draco was brimming with arrogance and ostentation. Honestly, if the two didn't share such strikingly similar bone structure and identical hair, Kasenhis might have started to wonder. No, he shouldn't wonder. That would be impolite. No one's stepping in to stop them. Kasenhis asked Snape. They could, but there's no need. Slytherin and Gryffindor have been at each other's throats for centuries. This is minor. At most, it'll draw the attention of someone overly eager to meddle. There is a meddler. That's Quib. Mr. Filch? He's a squib. And a defiant one at that. Most of the salary Dumbledore has paid him over the years has gone to one scam artist after another, all claiming to have a cure for wealthy squibs. Snape explained, uncharacteristically verbose. Got it. Kasenhis nodded. The little dinner drama hadn't caused even the slightest ripple. As Kasenhis finished his meal and was about to head back to his office, Snape suddenly spoke. By the way, you'll need to join me in the corridor later. The harmless potion you mentioned last time, I've brewed it. It's a variant of the draft of living death that works through air or skin contact. I need to load it into your alchemical contraption. No problem. Now. Yes please. The two left the Great Hall and headed straight for the corridor. When they reached the empty classroom near their destination, a record player suddenly appeared in Kasenhis's hands, along with a stack of records fanned out like playing cards. He was flipping through them as if making a selection. What are you doing? Snape asked, raising an eyebrow. Hagrid said that playing music can put that three-headed dog to sleep. I'm picking a track. No need for that. Snape shook his head, drawing his wand and stepping forward without hesitation. It's just a beast, after all. A simple stupefy shou. As soon as he opened the door, one of the heads bit him. Shit. I need music. Musica. Musica. Kasenhis yelled, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of panic. His eye twitched uncontrollably as he tossed the record player and records aside. With a swift motion, a block of obsidian materialized in his hand, splitting into three mid-air and crashing down heavily onto the three heads of the massive dog. Hiss! This beast bites faster than I expected, Snape muttered, rolling up his trouser leg to reveal a bloodied, torn wound on his shin. You were too careless, Kasenhis offered diplomatically, sparing Snape from having to voice his own embarrassment. Help me stand, will you? Of course. Kasenhis grabbed Snape's shoulder, steadying him as the latter fished a small bottle of bright red potion from his pocket and poured it directly onto the wound. Do you have any bandages? Snape asked curtly. This should do, though it's not exactly sterilized. Kasenhis pulled out a large piece of wool cloth, twisting and tugging it to form a makeshift bandage. That's fine. Snape took the cloth without protest, sprinkling some potion onto it before wrapping it tightly around his leg. Seems about right, Snape nodded, bending down to finish securing the makeshift bandage around his leg. Once he was satisfied, the two pressed on, steadily advancing through the various obstacles until they reached the final challenge. It was yet another reminder of Hagrid's unique approach to setting up obstacles. While the other professors, including Kasenhis, had designed their sections as something akin to a magical escape room for Quirrell or Harry to navigate, Hagrid's contribution was unabashedly aimed at outright eliminating any intruders. Yes. Hagrid's earnestness was certainly commendable. As the duo began loading the prepared potions into the dispensers, Kasenhis picked up one of the vials, turning it over in his hand with a curious expression. This potion. Authentic, Snape confirmed with a slight smirk. All right then. Although, honestly, I doubt these potions will even get a chance to come into play. They can always be retrieved later. Let's move, Snape replied, already heading toward the exit. The two retraced their steps back to the room with the enormous three-headed dog. Kasenhis, ever cautious, took out a long feather and used it to test the massive creature's breathing. To ensure the massive creature truly had 3 functioning sets of lungs, Kasenhis carefully tested all 3 heads for signs of breathing. Only after confirming they were all alive did he breathe a sigh of relief. After all, Hagrid was so fond of magical creatures that losing this big fellow would undoubtedly break his heart. Is your injury all right? Kasenhis turned to look at Snape. The teeth of a 3-headed dog are imbued with dark magic. Healing potions and Dittany won't work. It'll have to heal on its own. Do you want me to help? Maybe a wheelchair? Don't worry, completely magic-powered, no need for you to push the wheels yourself. No need, Snape said, his expression twitching slightly. All right, but if you ever need anything, feel free to send a student my way with a sealed envelope. If I need anything, I'll let you know, Snape replied stiffly. Understood. Want me to help you back to your office? Thank you, but I can manage. With a face like thunder, Snape hobbled off on his own. Meanwhile, the 2 notifications of increased approval from Snape that popped up in Kasenhis' mind utterly betrayed the stoic persona the man was trying so hard to maintain. This is pure tsundere behavior, Kasenhis muttered in disbelief. Back in his office, he glanced at the schedule propped up on his desk. No classes tomorrow, excellent. That meant he could stay up late tonight, or even skip sleep altogether. Once again, he marveled at how cushy the life of a Hogwarts elective course professor was compared to the main subject professors, who juggled 7 years of students across 4 houses, practically running full schedules every single day. Early mornings, back-to-back classes non-stop. Elective professors, on the other hand, lived the dream. Since students could choose whether to take their courses, most years combined all 4 houses into a single class. He only had 4 sessions a week. If Kasenhis wanted to push himself, he could cram all 4 sessions into one day and enjoy a 6-day weekend. A glorious 1 day on, 6 days off arrangement. But he hadn't dared to take that route. First, it would be exhausting. Second, pulling off a 1-day workweek was bound to attract the attention of certain unspeakable forces. Specifically, Albus Dumbledore. Kasenhis' imagination began to run wild, painting vivid mental images of Dumbledore's serene yet piercing gaze assigning him a mountain of additional tasks. With that ominous thought, he successfully talked himself out of the peaceful notion of spending the evening quietly listening to records in his office. Chapter 27 Poor Filch. Kasenhis sighed with regret. He really enjoyed listening to music, but for now, he had no choice but to leave his office and wander the castle like a student sneaking out after hours. Unfortunately, Filch didn't bother to chase after professors when patrolling for nighttime wanderers. That robbed Kasenhis of the thrill of outsmarting the cantankerous caretaker. On his way, he considered using a torch to light his path. But then he remembered that other wizards typically used dignified light spells like lumos. His burning pixel torch just didn't have the same flair. After a moment of thought, he summoned a glowing block of glowstone to float around him instead. Now that had style. Kasenhis made his way to the library. Unlike during the day, the place was devoid of its usual bustle. Without Madame Pance's hawk-like gaze scanning for rule breakers, it felt almost relaxing. Glowstone circling him like an ethereal lantern, Kasenhis headed straight for the restricted section. After all, he had earned his spot at Manchester University through sheer capability. His study skills were no joke. At this point, the ordinary alchemy books in the library couldn't keep up with him anymore. Of course, part of it was sheer boredom. Aside from alchemy, he couldn't learn any other magic. His unique powers meshed perfectly with alchemy, but most other magical subjects at Hogwarts were beyond him unless he could recreate them using blocks. If Hogwarts' magic curriculum weren't so easily replicated by his creations, he'd have given up long ago. But who knew? Maybe in the future, he'd raise his approval rating high enough with the castle itself to unlock a personal mod. Perhaps even command blocks? By then. Coo 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 coo. Cack. 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 Who's there? A raspy, quavering voice echoed from the distance, startling Kasenhis out of his musings. It's me, Kasenhis, Alchemy Professor. Are you Mr. Filch? Kasenhis waved his hand, and the glowstone block floated to his chest, illuminating his face. It's Professor His. Please don't laugh so creepily next time, Filch replied dryly. I'll keep that in mind. Am I disturbing your work? Kasenhis spoke politely. No, not at all. Filch, carrying his dim lantern, maneuvered through row after row of bookshelves until he finally appeared in front of Kasenhis. I just needed to confirm it's really you. Some cheeky little wizards like to mimic professors' voices to fool me. As long as you're the real deal, there's no issue. Hard work as always, Kasenhis nodded and then noticed the faint glow of Filch's lantern. Rubbing his fingers together, he conjured a finely crafted wrought iron lantern in his hand. This is our first proper meeting. Consider this a little gift. It's an alchemical creation, no need for fuel, and it'll shine like this indefinitely. For me? Not some prank. Filch looked at the pristine lantern, just inches away, with disbelief. A genuine alchemical artifact? He could hardly believe his ears. People play pranks on you. Kasenhis frowned. More often than you'd think. Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Slytherin, those mischievous little wizards are always at it. A candy that looks tasty but leaves your lips swollen for a week, or a shiny trinket that zaps you with a jolt of electricity too many to count. Filch shrugged, trying to appear indifferent as he recounted his misfortunes. You should talk to their respective heads of house about this. And for the record, I have no intention of making fun of you, Kasenhis said as he handed the lantern to Filch. Oh, thank you, Professor. Respect from Filch +10. Satisfaction from Filch +10. Respect from Filch +10. Trust from Filch +10. Trust from Filch +10. Trust from Filch +10. Kasenhis stared at the cascade of positive feedback notifications and found himself momentarily speechless. The man before him, Filch, might not lack for necessities, but it was clear he didn't receive equal respect. For something as simple as a lantern to spark such overwhelming gratitude, it was a little heartbreaking. What a poor guy. Professor, are you here to catch students out for a midnight stroll? Filch asked cautiously. No, Kasenhis replied, shaking his head. I just came to read. Couldn't sleep tonight. Then I won't disturb you. I've never met you before, but you must be an exceptional wizard. If you're ever curious about the odd rooms or secret passageways in this castle, just let me know, Filch offered. I will. Thank you. Filch nodded, holding his shiny new lantern, and walked away from the library. Kasenhis watched his retreating figure, noticing how the man's gait seemed lighter, almost rejuvenated. Filch, you might want to consider buying a faux glass. It could help you avoid pranks from the mischievous students and maybe even notice the ones who mean well, Kasenhis called out as a parting suggestion. I will, Professor, Filch replied. After spending some time in the restricted section of the library, Kasenhis found himself immersed in a book titled Forbidden Alchemy. How to put it? The depth of the alchemical knowledge wasn't exceptionally advanced, but the methods described within were undoubtedly sinister. The most disturbing section? Blood and Flesh Alchemy. It detailed methods of fusing organic matter with alchemical creations. In some distant future, perhaps 40 millennia ahead, this might be referred to as wetware. But that was just a fleeting storm of thoughts in his mind. What truly piqued his interest was another segment, the integration of alchemical constructs into living tissue, granting the host the abilities of the construct. This was something Kasenhis found particularly compelling and, more importantly, feasible without an overwhelming amount of effort. His other blocks like the explosive TNT didn't even resemble traditional explosives anymore. They just looked like glowing cubes, controlled telekinetically to fly toward their target. Similarly, wither skeleton skulls operated in the same way, their attack mechanics akin to black magic. Both were excellent for dealing with enemies. Other blocks, when compared to standard magical spells, performed just as efficiently. But the one thing he truly wanted to integrate into his body was the Ender Pearl. Ender Pearls required being thrown and shattered to activate their teleportation ability. This process was fraught with vulnerability. Interruptions by obstacles were tolerable, but the idea of being intercepted mid-throw by a killing curse? That was an entirely different kind of problem. Wouldn't that essentially turn into a flash to the grave scenario? But if the book before him could truly help him integrate an Ender Pearl into his body, granting him the teleportation ability of an Enderman, allowing instant movement to any location, it would be revolutionary. It was practically the same as Hogwarts taught apparition. However, unlike apparition, this method posed no risk of splinching, nor would it be hindered by anti-disapparition spells. If this worked, it would be perfect. Ahem. Yup, that laugh sounds disturbing. Chapter 28 Angry Kasenhis equals McGonagall plus Snape. Kasenhis quickly conjured a notebook and quill, meticulously copying down the section on flesh alchemy from Forbidden Alchemy. Once finished, he returned the book to the shelf, clutching his handwritten notes as he prepared to head back to his office. As he walked through the corridors back to his office, he suddenly heard the rapid patter of footsteps, almost like someone was fleeing. He shrugged it off. Must Filch chasing down some night-roaming students? Nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until he had walked about 70 meters past the staircase that he realized something. That staircase led directly to the classroom Dumbledore had designated for his bait and trap experiment. The one with Hagrid's three-headed dog inside. Sweet Merlin's beard. A shimmering Ender Pearl materialized in Kasenhis's hand. Within 3 breaths, he teleported to the door of that very classroom. He pushed the door open hurriedly, only to see 4 familiar young wizards frozen in place. At the same time, the distant flicker of light from a lantern came into view, accompanied by labored breathing. Professor Kasenhis? Have you seen 4 little mischief-makers sneaking around tonight? Filch's voice carried over. Kasenhis glanced down at the 4 young wizards crouching desperately at his feet, shaking their heads frantically. He looked back up at Filch and shook his head in turn. I see. I'll check the other floors, then. Those sneaky brats won't escape my clutches. Filch muttered sinisterly as he descended the staircase, lantern bobbing in the gloom. After ensuring Filch had left, Kasenhis grabbed each student in turn and swiftly yanked all 4 out of the room in 2 quick motions. Harry, Neville, Ron, Hermione. Kasenhis began sternly, his voice as sharp as a whip. Care to explain why you're sneaking around at night? Actually, scratch that. Night roaming is minor compared to this. Do you realize that this big fellow in there could devour 3 of you in 2 moves? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping ominously. And the last one would still be divided into 3 pieces. Once they were safely back in his office, Kasenhis folded his arms, glaring at the 4 as they squirmed under his intense gaze. His tone was unyielding. Malfoy, Ron blurted, voice tinged with frustration. He challenged us to a duel, but he ran off and snitched to Filch. We were just trying to avoid losing points, so we ran. Points? Points. Kasenhis cut him off sharply. You should have let Filch take the points. Did Dumbledore not warn everyone at the start of term about the danger in that classroom? Did that warning go in one ear and out the other? He jabbed a finger toward them for emphasis. Would you prefer losing some house points or losing your lives? Worst case, Filch might have given you detention. Are you telling me death is more appealing than detention? If it's detention with Snape, it might actually be. Harry, shut your mouth. Kasenhis said in frustration, making Harry flinch. You clearly don't grasp the gravity of what happened tonight. You utterly misjudged the danger of your choices. Before running into that classroom, you should have remembered Dumbledore's warning from the start of term. Fine, maybe you panicked and made a mistake, fair enough. But once you saw the three-headed dog, why didn't you immediately turn and run? You honestly thought that big dog was sound asleep? Kasenhis's voice rose sharply, his expression livid. Even if I hadn't told you, you should have seen for yourselves if that dog had decided to attack. Harry, Neville, and Ron would have been gone in a single bite each. And Hermione? You'd have been last and the worst off, because you'd have been bitten into 3 pieces. The angrier he got, the more his voice echoed around the office. Earlier in the evening, he and Snape had been installing potion launchers for the piston door. Kasenhis had seen Snape, a wizard with decades of experience, cast a silver sheen of a shield charm over himself before entering. Even then, the three-headed dog had managed to tear through his defenses. What's worse, after Kasenhis had knocked the dog unconscious, it transitioned seamlessly into a deep sleep. This meant the dog had been sleeping on an empty stomach. Now, if it had woken up groggy and found 3 entrees and a dessert, well, the outcome was grim to even imagine. You know what? Forget it. Prepare to lose points. No, wait, I'm a professor, I'll just dock them myself. Gryffindor, 4 students, 50 points each. The 4 students hung their heads low. For the first time, they realized just how frightening Professor Kasenhis could be when angry. Usually warm and sunny like a small ray of light, his fury rivaled McGonagall's imposing demeanor, paired with a tongue as sharp as Snape's. But one particularly sensitive young wizard noticed something else behind Kasenhis's anger. A thread of worry, hidden beneath his booming reprimand. I'm sorry, Professor. Neville muttered, his voice trembling as tears welled up in his eyes. Neville. Kasenhis's instinctive reaction was to crouch down and comfort him, but he stopped himself just in time. No. He needed to stay firm. Strict. Authoritative. Do you understand your mistake now? Kasenhis asked, his tone still sharp but slightly softer. Yes. The 4 mumbled in unison. And what exactly have you learned? We shouldn't have gone into that classroom, Ron offered hesitantly. Beyond that. Kasenhis exclaimed, his hands resting on his hips. It's not just about the classroom, it's about how you completely failed to assess the situation. Can't you use your heads to weigh the difference between losing points and losing your lives? Which is scarier? We'll think, Professor. We will, Harry replied, his voice subdued. And another thing, you can't keep relying on luck. That dog. I knocked it out earlier this afternoon. But just now, you couldn't have known for certain if it was sleeping or unconscious. What if it had woken up? Or worse, woken up hungry? He paused mid-round and glanced down. Neville, at least Neville. Kasenhis's voice shifted from exasperation to disbelief as he noticed the small puddle forming at Neville's feet. The boy stood frozen, his face pale with embarrassment. Kasenhis pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed deeply, his frustration mingled with resignation. All right. I think you've all understood the seriousness of what happened. The group nodded, their heads hanging low. So once again, what have you learned from this? Next time you face a situation like this, weigh the pros and cons in your mind. Though that sounds a bit like Slytherin, the 4 said in unison, with Ron mumbling the last part under his breath. The traits of all 4 houses are strengths, Kasenhis corrected, his tone firm. You shouldn't let your dislike of Slytherin blind you to their good qualities, much less discard them like trash. We understand, Professor, they replied, nodding. All right then, head straight back to your dormitories, Kasenhis instructed, pointing towards the door, which creaked open with a wave of his hand. He hesitated for a moment. Actually, I don't trust you entirely after all, you are Gryffindors. I'll escort you back. Professor, that's really not necessary, Neville said, his eyes still red from earlier. Think of it as helping you avoid Filch. The walk back was silent, the group subdued after Kasenhis's lecture. When they finally reached Gryffindor Tower, he waited until all 4 had safely climbed through the portrait hole behind the fat lady. Fwaya! Only then did Kasenhis let out a long sigh, his stern expression relaxing. Keeping a serious face is exhausting. I don't know how Severus manages it 24/7. And as for my blood and flesh alchemy, that's 2 hours of my life gone. Filch wasn't wrong, these little kids of Hogwarts are really too mischievous. And Gryffindors? A little too reckless. Muttering to himself, Kasenhis turned and made his way back to his office. Chapter 29 A Terrifying Scream. Upon waking up to a new day, Kasenhis groggily climbed out of bed. Yesterday, thanks to the antics of 4 mischievous Gryffindor students, his planned alchemy experiment had been shelved. Well, mischievous wasn't quite the right word, perhaps brainless would be more accurate. And what was Dumbledore even thinking that day? Letting Hagrid use such a massive 3-headed dog as a security measure? Truly baffling. Still stewing in frustration, Kasenhis made his way to the Great Hall and sat down for breakfast. As he stared at the dry, distinctly English fare on his plate, he felt a wave of resignation. So this is life, huh? After finishing his meal, Kasenhis didn't return to his office. Instead, he headed straight for the Forbidden Forest. He had a plan: find a test subject. After all, he couldn't just impulsively decide to stitch an ender pearl into his flesh. That wasn't experimentation, that was suicide. On the way, he bumped into Hagrid, who was out with his dog, or rather, his hound, whom he called Fang. Naturally, Hagrid was curious. Going into the forest, Professor Cassen? What's it for? I need to conduct an alchemical experiment. I'll need some live test subjects. Hagrid instinctively tilted his head back to look at the sky, as though silently seeking divine guidance. Test subjects? How about a chicken? It probably won't work, Kasenhis said, shaking his head. We wizards have magic, right? So technically, the test subjects also need to have magic. Ah, gotcha. Well, this all sounds too complicated for me, best of luck, then. Hagrid scratched his head, already overwhelmed by the mention of anything remotely technical. Wanting to save himself from further brain strain, he hastily tugged Fang along, putting some distance between himself and Kasenhis. Hey! Why are you running off? I wasn't finished talking yet. Kasenhis called after him. Hagrid quickened his pace. No, no. I've had enough, thank you. You sound just like my old charms professor from when I was a student. Terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. All right then. May you dream of that professor every night. Kasenhis shouted in mock blessing. In the distance, Hagrid stumbled slightly as he hurried away. That afternoon, Kasenhis combed through the outskirts of the Forbidden Forest, rounding up a variety of magical creatures and locking them in separate cages. By the time he was done, he could safely call it a productive day. As for what kinds of creatures he'd caught? Well, he wasn't entirely sure himself. His method was simple: wander around the forest, spot a magical beast, then toss an ender pearl to teleport next to it and take a solid swing at it. For the larger creatures, he employed a different tactic, whacking them with obsidian blocks. If one hit didn't do the job, a second one usually did. Dragging a chain of cages behind him, Kasenhis returned to his office under the bewildered stares of passing students, who couldn't help but give him strange looks. Once inside, he carefully lined up the cages in the corner of the room, ensuring all the creatures had food and water before leaving them be. Then, he summoned an enchanting table, placed an ender pearl into it, and began the process. Before long, a glowing ender pearl infused with shimmering purple light emerged, resting neatly in his hand. Then he pulled out a grindstone, placed the enchanted pearl on it, and started cranking. Each rotation of the grindstone caused a series of symbols to emerge. Some were the glowing purple enchantment runes, while others were the natural markings of the ender pearl. This continued until crack, the sound of shattering echoed through the office. Ah! A scream that sounded eerily like Tom Riddle himself. Hey! What's going on in here? That's one intense scream. What did you do to yourself? Professor Sprout, who had been walking down the corridor, froze at the terrifying noise coming from Kasenhis' office. She debated for a mere 2.5 seconds before barging in, fearing the worst. Her eyes widened when she saw Kasenhis. He was covered in scrapes and bruises, looking like he'd been through a battlefield. There wasn't a single untouched patch of skin left on him. Young people these days. Is this some kind of new fashion trend? Or did you actually get hurt this badly? Why haven't you gone to Madame Pomfrey yet? It's not fashion, Kasenhis groaned, shaking his head as he scribbled the symbols onto a piece of parchment. I just didn't have time to go. I've been working on a new alchemy technique. Sprout sighed in exasperation but didn't push further. As long as you're all right, I suppose. Oh, and here, take this. She pulled a small bottle of essence of Dittany from her pocket and placed it on his desk. If you're too embarrassed to let the students see you in this state, you can patch yourself up with this. Thank you, Professor. All right then, I'll leave you to your magical research. Professor Sprout gave a polite nod and left the room, closing the door behind her. Almost immediately after, another scream eerily similar to Tom Riddle's infamous wails erupted from Kasenhis office. Kids these days, always up to something, Sprout muttered to herself as she walked away. Kasenhis spent the rest of the day alternating between dabbing essence of Dittany on his bruises with a cotton swab and studying the dense, intricate enchantment symbols scrawled across his parchment. The whole time, he could feel the weight of his efforts pressing on him. His singular thought, sleep. The next day. Evening. Click click click. Kasenhis carefully placed a thoroughly enchanted magical creature into a cauldron nearby. It was set to automatically notify the house elves to retrieve it and take it to the kitchens. His experiment was nearing success. According to the enchantment logic derived from the enchanting table, every object had its own set of unique enchantment symbols. The same could apply to humans. All I need to do is fill the gaps in the human enchantment symbols with the ones from the Ender Pearl. But that last step was proving tricky not because it was particularly difficult, but because the magical creature's enchantment symbols were so densely packed that finding any space to insert the new symbols was almost impossible. Am I really going to have to try this directly on a human? Will I die because of this? Will I lose all my gear? Will my entire office just get filled with an explosion of blocks all at once? Would it look cool though? Let's just hope I don't start shitting blocks, that wouldn't be cool. Alright, Kasenhis was not the type to maintain a serious mindset. No matter how deeply he pondered a problem, intrusive thoughts always barged in, armed with absurd jokes that left him more exasperated than enlightened. Knock, knock, knock. The sound of knocking broke his train of thought. With a wave of his hand, the door creaked open. Professor Kasenhis? We came to apologize, came Harry's voice as he entered alongside Neville. Kasenhis glanced at the two young wizards. Just Harry and Neville. There's no need to apologize to me, he said, putting his hands on his hips and letting out a sigh of relief. You just need to understand what you did wrong. Most mistakes can be fixed, what matters is that you learn from them and don't repeat them. Professor, are you disappointed in me? Neville suddenly lifted his head to ask. No, I'm not disappointed in any of you, Kasenhis replied without hesitation. Really? Really, Kasenhis nodded firmly. That's a relief, Neville exhaled, visibly relaxing. Professor, I actually prepared a gift for you earlier. I hope you like it. Then, he reached behind his waist and pulled. Nothing? The gift box? I think I left it here yesterday. Chapter 30 The Troll. Don't rush, take your time to find it. Neville was once more on the verge of crying. By the way, based on the dangerous things you've done before, I've realized you're not exactly trouble-free. So, take this. Kasenhis said as he summoned an Ender Pearl, handing it to Neville while offering some reassurance. If you encounter danger that you can't handle, just smash this, and I'll appear by your side. It works even within Hogwarts, and it's not part of apparition magic. Neville blushed as he accepted the Ender Pearl but then remembered once again how he had forgotten to bring the gift he had intended to give. Harry noticed Neville's predicament and quickly changed the subject. By the way, Professor, are you planning to attend tonight's Halloween feast? Kasenhis glanced at the calendar propped in the corner of his desk and suddenly understood. Time really flies. That explains why Professor Sprout asked me earlier about my makeup. She must have thought I was testing a costume. So, will you go, Professor? Neville asked as he carefully tucked away the Ender Pearl. Of course, I'll be there, but you'll need to give me some time to clean myself up. I haven't left my office in nearly a day and a half. Kasenhis spread his hands, and with that, Harry and Neville hurriedly left the office. Finally alone, Kasenhis collected the notes detailing the Ender Pearl's enchantment patterns and stored them away. He then headed into his private quarters, enjoying a long, refreshing bath before standing in front of his wardrobe to pick something suitable. Before long, Kasenhis emerged wearing a deep purple robe, taking his place at the professor's table in the Great Hall. Originally, the robe had been black, but after witnessing the three-headed dog easily pierce Snape's defensive spell, Kasenhis had been struck by Hogwarts' dangers. He had spent the night enchanting the robe into a battle-ready wizard's garment, which now also served as a stylish formal ensemble. "I must say, that robe suits you," Dumbledore commented, his eyes twinkling as he admired the shimmering brilliance of Kasenhis' attire. Not bad at all," Kasenhis replied with a smirk. "Perhaps you could make me some socks." "You know, as one ages, the cold becomes harder to bear," Dumbledore said, his eyes twinkling. "I hope for a new pair of socks." "Not happening." "Ah, well." Dumbledore looked a bit disappointed but let it go. Just as the calm atmosphere seemed to settle over the Great Hall, Professor Quirrell burst in, panting heavily. "Troll in the dungeons thought you ought to know." Quirrell stammered out before promptly collapsing on the floor. "Well, it seems the Halloween feast will have to be postponed," Dumbledore muttered under his breath before standing and addressing the hall. "Students of the four houses, follow your prefects back to your common rooms immediately. Do not stray from the group. All professors, begin searching the castle inside and out to locate the troll." "I bet Quirrell let it in yelling catch the thief to cover his tracks," Kasenhis whispered to Dumbledore as he rose. "I'm delighted to inform you," Dumbledore murmured back with a sly grin, "that you're absolutely correct." "Merlin's beard." Kasenhis muttered under his breath, pulling out his wand and leaving the professor's table. He headed in the direction Quirrell had come from, though at a leisurely pace. Hogwarts was enormous, finding a single troll in the castle was no simple task. Realistically, it might take the entire night. And with the students already being herded back to their respective common rooms, a rampaging troll could only damage property. If that happened, it would be his time to shine, showcasing his extraordinary building skills. He was already imagining it, in front of the entire school, he'd perform a grand construction miracle, rebuilding whatever was broken. Hogwarts would be amazed by his alchemical craftsmanship. What a spectacle it would be! But then, he felt it, a shard of an ender pearl shattered. The next moment, he was in a crumbling corridor, face to face with two terrified students. Harry was slumped against a wall in a corner, pale and panting. Neville's leg was clearly broken, but his face lit up with relief at the sight of Kasenhis appearing out of nowhere. He hastily pointed behind him. Kasenhis turned around just in time to see Ron clinging desperately to the back of a troll. He was attempting to choke it, but unfortunately, trolls don't have necks. Hermione was crumpled in a corner, seemingly unconscious. "Professor, look out!" It was unclear who shouted, but the troll noticed the wizard who had suddenly appeared in front of it. Its small brain couldn't comprehend how this person had materialized, but instinctively, it raised its club and swung it down. Swoosh! Boom! Kasenhis stood his ground, taking the blow head-on. It wasn't because he was posturing as some untouchable wizard, he simply didn't have time to react. "Professor!" Luckily, his shameless decision to over-enchant his robes multiple times paid off. What should have been a skull-crushing blow felt more like someone knocking on his head with a heavy stick. The robes didn't even rip. "Wow! Ahem! Professor, are you okay?" Kasenhis shook his head to clear it. "Ron, get out of here, now!" Ron, seeing that Kasenhis had arrived, exhaled in relief. With surprising agility, he leapt off the troll's back, scooped up Hermione in his arms, and ran behind Kasenhis. Satisfied that the students were safely out of harm's way, Kasenhis lured the troll toward the far corner of the corridor. Once he deemed it far enough to prevent any collateral damage, he summoned a block emitting a radiant white light. Slamming it directly into the troll's chest, he quickly called forth an ender pearl and teleported himself out. Thud! Kasenhis reappeared in front of Ron and Neville, summoning an obsidian wall that shielded them from the gruesome aftermath of the explosion. "Wicked! You were so cool!" "Ha still," he muttered, wrinkling his nose, "that thing stinks to high heaven." Carrying Neville in one arm and Hermione in the other, with Harry slung over his back, Kasenhis marched toward the hospital wing. Ron followed close behind, his steps uneven but determined. Once he handed all four students over to Madame Pomfrey, Kasenhis went straight to find Dumbledore. "You should just give Quirrell a whole bottle of Verita serum," Kasenhis said bluntly. "One troll almost killed 4 students. Who's to say he hasn't let in more?" Dumbledore placed a calming hand on Kasenhis' shoulder. "Relax, relax. I've already confirmed there was only one troll, and it's no longer an issue thanks to your quick thinking. You can breathe easy now. It better be the only one." Kasenhis folded his arms. "Still, I think you should have Quirrell restrained." If you're too soft to do it, I'm happy to handle it. Give me a sack, and I'll make sure he's glued to a wheelchair until the Christmas holidays. Dumbledore gave Kasenhis an amused yet puzzled look. I wasn't aware you had such aggressive tendencies. You've always struck me as rather laid back. Quirrell just threw a troll into Hogwarts. What wouldn't he dare to do at this point? Do you expect me to sit back, act calm, and say, oh, Quirrell's just a misunderstood good guy? Kasenhis said with some exaggerated hand movements. I understand, but you can rest assured, really. Chapter 31 I'm the headmaster, bam. Kasenhis stared at Dumbledore, whose demeanour remained calm and unruffled, for a rare moment of silence. Finally, he spoke. You say you have everything under control, but what about today's mess? Today's incident was an accident, Dumbledore replied evenly. If you keep handling things like this, you're going to regret it one day. Perhaps, Dumbledore admitted with a small shrug. But until that day comes, I am still the headmaster of Hogwarts, and I have the authority to. Bam! Kasenhis punched Dumbledore square in the nose, cutting him off mid-sentence. Without another word, he stormed out of the office, slamming the door shut behind him with a resounding crash. Familiar force. Dumbledore muttered, holding his slightly crooked nose and sighing wistfully. If he had hit just a little harder, it might have actually straightened out. Meanwhile, Kasenhis, fuming and determined, made his way toward the hospital wing. Then, +10 satisfaction from Albus Dumbledore. +10 trust from Albus Dumbledore. +10 favorability from Albus Dumbledore. Could this be some kind of masochistic kink? Kasenhis involuntarily shuddered at the thought, quickly shaking it out of his mind. He briskly made his way to the hospital wing, slipping into Quirrell's ward when Madame Pomfrey wasn't looking. He stood there, debating whether to use an anvil, obsidian, or just unleash a wither skeleton skull to obliterate Quirrell and whatever was attached to the back of his head. Cassen! A low voice interrupted his thoughts from behind. Kasenhis turned slightly, lowering his voice. Severus! We need to talk. If Dumbledore sent you, I'm sorry, but not until I deal with this, Kasenhis replied curtly. Snape, ever cooperative when the situation amused him, nodded and turned his back. Kasenhis wasted no time flipping Quirrell over so he was face down, exposing his back. Ultimately, he decided against the wither skull. Instead, he took out some obsidian and began meticulously crushing it into fine powder along Quirrell's spine, focusing especially on the base of his skull. He ensured to hammer the area repeatedly, for good measure. Finally, Snape, unable to ignore the increasingly unsettling sounds, reached out and stopped Kasenhis mid-swing, shaking his head slowly. Whew! Kasenhis followed Snape out of the hospital wing. Snape walked ahead in silence until Kasenhis suddenly spoke up. It's not like that was a serious injury for Madame Pomfrey to deal with. I didn't really want to kill him. Well, I had the thought, but I still have some sense. Even if I don't know the specifics of Dumbledore's plans, I respect them, Kasenhis explained. I just figured if those two could stay bedridden a bit longer, Hogwarts might enjoy a few more peaceful days. You're a genuinely wicked person, Snape commented dryly, not bothering to look back at him. I'll take that as a compliment, Kasenhis replied with a nod. Suit yourself. And you don't have to think so much about it. Even though he's famous as the century's White Wizard, Dumbledore never pretended to be a saint. Did you know one of his nicknames, famous among the elites of the wizarding world? The White Dark Lord. I was somewhat prepared for that. I know a stereotypical good guy wouldn't end up as the headmaster of a magical school. Especially one that has to constantly deal with the ministry. I just can't stand that attitude of his. I can't quite put it into words. And his arrogance. 4 students nearly went to see Merlin, and he still insists everything is part of the plan, under control. I just couldn't hold back. Maybe I should find a time to apologize to him. Snape quietly acted as the listener, and when Kasenhis mentioned giving Dumbledore's nose a solid hit, a small smile crept onto Snape's face. Honestly, you did what I've always wanted to do. Maybe. But why would you want to do it? Also because of the students' safety. Not that. Then, pent-up frustration against the boss. Also not that. This issue is more complicated. All right then. Kasenhis shrugged and fell silent. Dumbledore asked me to check if you were just planning to temporarily incapacitate Quirrell and vent your anger. Since you've clearly achieved both, my task is complete. Also, I recall you don't have any classes coming up. Perhaps you should find a way to relax, Snape said as he walked ahead. Wow, are you trying to comfort me? If that's how you want to interpret it, then yes. Thanks. Maybe I'll go find a small house to renovate. Like Hagrid's hut, been meaning to tear it down and build something new. Do as you please. Back in his office, Kasenhis collapsed into his chair, leaning back with his feet propped up on the desk. He sighed, realizing he'd acted too hastily earlier. He should have checked on Harry, Neville, and the others first, then gone to break Quirrell's spine. Messed up the order. Now, though, there was no fixing it. Pfft. Or rather, he didn't intend to. Kasenhis knew himself well he was terrible at lying. When Madame Pomfrey stormed up to him one day, furious, and asked, "Do you know who might have a grudge against Professor Quirrell?" There was no way he'd be able to hold it in. Absolutely not. He'd probably laugh right there on the spot. Just as Kasenhis was savoring this remarkably comfortable posture, appreciating the wonders of ergonomics, there came a knock at the office door. "It's not locked, come in." Dumbledore entered, a piece of gauze stuck to his nose with a support brace holding it in place. He was carrying a fruit basket. "Kasenhis, I owe you an apology for my arrogance." Dumbledore placed the fruit basket on the desk. "Ah. So what did wasn't bad at all?" Kasenhis awkwardly pulled his feet down from the desk. "Your plans didn't hurt me. If you're going to apologize, it should be to Harry, Neville, and Hermione. And Ron. Honestly, he's the perfect example of a Gryffindor." In the middle of it all, he even tried to choke the troll with his arms, even though the troll's neck was thicker than his waist. "They've already woken up, and I've sincerely apologized to them," Dumbledore said. "Now I'm here to apologize to you. My arrogance has hurt the heart of a truly great professor who loves Hogwarts and its young witches and wizards." Dumbledore sat down, his tone earnest and heartfelt. "This feels a bit awkward, and stop looking at me like that, it's kind of gross," Kasenhis said with a shiver of discomfort. Dumbledore shook his head with a small smile. "All right then." Kasenhis adjusted his posture, sitting up straighter. He wasn't great at discussing grand ideals, so he opted to change the subject. "I don't know your exact plan, but now that I've incapacitated Quirrell, he shouldn't be able to cause any trouble while his spine grows back." "I'm glad you didn't outright kill him," Dumbledore replied calmly. "To be honest, I considered it. But then I thought, considering how hard you've made Voldemort out to be to kill, keeping him under watch might not be the worst idea. Thank you for your understanding." Chapter 32 Fusion of Ender Pearls. A week later, Kasenhis sat in his office, fiddling gloomily with the enchanting table in front of him. Because, as it turned out, he had underestimated Madame Pomfrey's skills. Quirrell, whom he had beaten into near oblivion, was back on the podium of the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom after just 1 week. Kasenhis wasn't the only one in a sour mood. Snape was too. However, their reasons for displeasure were different. Kasenhis was upset because Quirrell, that walking disaster, was back to causing trouble. Snape, on the other hand, was unhappy because the Defense Against the Dark Arts substitute teaching position he had just secured for a week was snatched away again. For now, Kasenhis forced himself to push any malicious thoughts about Quirrell out of his head, focusing instead on the enchanting table in front of him. He had been working on this for a week, trying to infuse the magic of the Ender Pearl into his body. Everything was ready, and he was just one step away from success. A few chunks of lapis lazuli appeared in his hands, which he carefully placed on the enchanting table. Previously, when enchanting his wand and wizarding robes, he had gone with the overwhelm it with massive amounts of magic approach. But now, enchanting his own body required precision anything less than perfect, and he might end up dead. With that, he placed an ancient book on the enchanting table. The book began to float in the air. In an instant, strands of runic symbols and patterns were drawn from the book, combining with the magic to form a slow-moving purple light. Zap! Boom! In the headmaster's office, Dumbledore's heart skipped a beat at the sound of the explosion. "Lady in White, do you know what just happened?" he asked a portrait visiting the headmaster's office. "I'll go find out," the Lady in White replied, leaving her frame. She returned a short while later. There was an explosion in the alchemy office. Professor Kasenhis has vanished. Dumbledore's usually calm and collected expression stiffened for a moment. "Let's hope nothing serious has happened," Standing up, he thought for a moment before calling Fawkes and operating directly into the alchemy office. The scene he arrived at was one of utter destruction. The office was in complete disarray, clearly ravaged by a powerful explosion. As for Kasenhis was scattered across various corners of the office. This wasn't some high-level duplication spell, it was simply that he had been moving too fast for anyone to keep track. Professor Kasenhis. Hey! Help me, I can't stop myself. Dumbledore pulled out the Elder Wand and gave it a slight wave. The uncontrollably teleporting Kasenhis finally came to a halt, or rather, he was caught and held in place by a much stronger spatial force. Every time he attempted to teleport, a strange, overwhelming spatial power dragged him back to the same spot. Phew, thanks, oh by Merlin's beard. Looks like I'll have to renovate this office yet again, Kasenhis muttered, patting his chest to calm his nerves after the harrowing ordeal. Before you get to that, would you mind explaining what exactly you were doing? Dumbledore asked, finding a chair that was still relatively intact and settling into it. Take a look at this, Kasenhis replied, tossing an ender pearl to Dumbledore. This alchemical artifact. What does it do? Smash it by throwing. Dumbledore nodded, then threw the pearl onto the floor. With a hum, Kasenhis immediately appeared at the spot where the pearl shattered. Oh, how fascinating! Truly remarkable alchemy, Dumbledore said with genuine admiration. But you still haven't told me why you turned this place into a wasteland. Kasenhis's expression suddenly turned constipated, and after a moment of hesitation, he pulled out the small booklet he had copied from Forbidden Alchemy about the fusion of flesh and alchemy. Merlin's socks. Dumbledore flipped through the pages and remarked, you should have involved me. This is incredibly dangerous. I've already conducted plenty of experiments. The success rate is quite promising. How high? A solid 24%, which translates to a 76% chance of failure. Dumbledore sighed in exasperation. I genuinely hope you'll start valuing your own life as much as you value the lives of the students. Kasenhis shrugged. Relax, just think of it as me pulling a little prank. The real probability is definitely not as low as I said, really, relax. Let's hope that's true. Can I release your restriction now? Dumbledore asked, exhaling deeply. Go ahead. I think I've got control of myself now. Dumbledore pulled out his wand and gave it a flick. In the next instant, Kasenhis felt a freedom unlike anything he had ever experienced before. With just a thought, he teleported behind Dumbledore. Kakeek. This is actually pretty amazing, he marveled, looking like a villain. Quite remarkable indeed. From that day onward, Kasenhis's life felt as if it had been switched to easy mode. For one, the commute time he used to loathe was reduced to a mere 1 or 2 seconds. Though, at first, he often accidentally teleported to the potions classroom below the alchemy classroom. It was quite awkward. But those were minor hiccups. The real situation at hand was Madame Hooch, the flying instructor, currently seated on the corner sofa in his office. In front of her was a large leather trunk. I'm very glad you opened your door for me. It saves me the trouble of lugging these little troublemakers back to their manufacturer, Madame Hooch said cheerfully. Kasenhis nodded. Of course I'd open my door for you. But, what exactly is this? A complete set of Quidditch balls, a quaffle, 2 blood jars and a golden snitch. The Quidditch Cup is coming up soon, and I need to make sure these are all in top condition before the matches. That's why I came to you, Madame Hooch explained with a grin. Sure thing. But to be honest, don't set your expectations too high. I haven't worked on these kinds of things before, Kasenhis said as he accepted the trunk. With a click, he opened it, and the golden snitch immediately fluttered its wings, trying to escape. Luckily, the box's restraints held it securely. This little one is full of energy, Kasenhis said, giving it a tap with his left hand and inspecting it curiously. After some fiddling, he finally asked, Madame Hooch, may I ask, do Quidditch balls typically have enchantments to guard against malicious curses? Naturally, Madame Hooch replied. Take the bludger, for instance. You've seen how massive it is. If it doesn't follow Quidditch rules and just barrels into someone relentlessly, it could easily kill a player. I see. Well, I'm sorry to say this, Madame Hooch, but from now on, you'll need to guard this set of balls more carefully. Their protective enchantments have been removed, Kasenhis said, firmly gripping a massive bludger with both hands as he walked toward the nearby enchantment table. In less than a minute, all 4 balls were properly re-enchanted. Thank you so much, Professor Kasenhis. Without you, these balls might have caused a lot of mess, Madame Hooch said gratefully, lifting the large trunk. Madame Hooch, you may be mistaken. It's not that there may have been a big mess, but there would definitely have been a big mess. Chapter 33 Harry, I've figured it out. What do you mean, Professor? Madame Hooch asked. I just took a look at the remnants of the magical circuits in this set of balls. They're extremely sturdy, there's no way a mischievous little wizard could have erased them, Kasenhis explained. So? That means it could only have been someone with significant magical skill, someone with ulterior motives within Hogwarts, Kasenhis clarified. Could it affect the start of the Quidditch Cup? And that's why, Madame Hooch being so unreliable, I went to Dumbledore and suggested that before the Quidditch Cup begins, I personally inspect all your brooms and the match balls as well, Kasenhis explained, holding the enchanting table while re-enchanting the golden snitch in his hands. Although most flying brooms have anti-curse magical circuits, if someone can tamper with the Quidditch balls, there's no reason to believe they couldn't tamper with your brooms too. He finished the explanation while turning to Harry, who stood nearby, looking both concerned and intrigued. Mr. Wood, the golden snitch. Kasenhis handed the re-enchanted snitch to Oliver Wood after completing its enchantment. Oh, thank you, Professor. No need to thank me. Now, bring over all your brooms, I need to inspect each one. Some may even need re-enchantment. Kasenhis picked up his quill and began writing runes on the parchment, recreating protective anti-curse enchantments specifically for brooms. One by one, the brooms lined up as if in a queue, passing over the enchanting table. Each broom, now shimmering with a faint purple glow, returned to its owner's hands. Slytherin team, please bring your brooms over for inspection, Kasenhis called out. The Slytherin players gathered around. Professor Kasenhis, I'm Marcus Flint of the Flint family, the Slytherin team captain introduced himself, extending his hand. Pleasure to meet you, Marcus, Kasenhis said, shaking Flint's hand. Your brooms, please. Professor Kasenhis, surely this isn't necessary for us Slytherins? Marcus asked hesitantly. In my eyes, all of you are just fragile young witches and wizards. Kasenhis replied firmly. But we are the Slytherins, I don't think someone will target. Listen, Mr. Flint, I regret that I can't take the risk. And don't go thinking of yourselves as dark wizard trainees, and don't expect dark wizards to spare you just because you're Slytherins. Kasenhis picked up a broom, placed it on the enchantment table, and began his work while muttering his thoughts aloud. Honestly, I've never believed Slytherins are destined to be some sort of dark wizard apprentices. And I certainly don't want you resigning yourselves to such a fate. In other words, just because some dark wizards happen to be Slytherins during their time at Hogwarts, that doesn't mean you should feel any kind of bizarre kinship with them. You might feel some connection to them, but trust me, they won't feel the same way about you. As Kasenhis grumbled and enchanted the Slytherin students' brooms, he finally finished the last one, picked up the enchanting table, shrank it, and tucked it into his pocket. Play well, he said curtly. Snap. With a loud snap, he disappeared from the spot and reappeared in the professor's stand. You've been a great help, Kasenhis, Dumbledore said with a smile. It's nothing, just a small favor. I just hope that scheming scoundrel keeps their head down and doesn't let me catch them red-handed, Kasenhis replied darkly, his gaze frequently drifting toward Quirrell seated ahead of him. Don't be like that, perhaps you should relax a little, Professor Flitwick said, attempting to soothe him. As the saying goes, Hogwarts is the safest place in the world. Oh, let's hope so. The Quidditch match concluded smoothly, with the referee declaring Gryffindor the winner. As for how they won, forgive me, but I truly couldn't see a thing, Dumbledore, Kasenhis said, following the headmaster as they left the stands. A group of people flying around on brooms, zooming back and forth, it's hard to make out what's even happening. Is this really enjoyable? That's the charm of Quidditch, Dumbledore replied with a chuckle. Perhaps you should borrow a few books from Madame Pants. You might discover the hidden joys of the game. I think I still prefer building, Kasenhis muttered. You'll have your chance, Dumbledore said with a smile. And as always, I insist start with my office. When I have time, Kasenhis replied casually. Descending from the stands, Kasenhis returned to his usual leisurely pace. He disliked moving too fast, he preferred to stroll along, soaking in the rhythm of a slow, unhurried life. Oh, and it was even better to have a companion who shared his love for a relaxed pace. Well, maybe not quite a companion at the moment. Severus, your leg hasn't fully healed yet. Kasenhis asked softly as he noticed Snape limping along. It's a wound tainted with dark magic, remember? Snape replied tersely. Perhaps I could make you a cane, Kasenhis suggested smoothly. If you're not fond of wheelchairs, a cane could double as a gentleman's accessory. Or even a staff. It's very British, you know. Without warning, Kasenhis slung an arm around Snape's shoulders and, with a slight lift, subtly adjusted his weight. From behind, it looked almost like they were just walking arm in arm, casually chatting. For example, I can't believe it, Professor Kasenhis and Snape get along so well. Ron exclaimed, trailing behind the two with wide eyes. He's just so cool. Professor Kasenhis gets along well with everyone, but why does he have to be like that with Snape too? Harry grumbled, clearly not pleased. Wow, Harry just won the match, so why does he seem so upset? Ron asked, puzzled. Of course, it's because Professor Kasenhis has been deceived by a dark wizard. Harry declared indignantly. What do you mean? Ron looked even more confused. Remember when I went to the library to borrow a book? I ran into Snape on the staircase. At that moment, he lifted his pant leg and poured a bottle of red potion on it. The wound, it looked like a bite from some beast, Harry said, vividly recounting the scene. Are you trying to say that the wound came from the three-headed dog? But that doesn't necessarily mean he's a dark wizard, right? Hermione said skeptically. I have my evidence. Remember that day in the room where the three-headed dog was kept? Do you recall what was underneath it? Harry looked at his three companions expectantly. Neville shook his head. I don't have a good memory. There was something under the three-headed dog. Ron maintained his usual level of cluelessness. A trapdoor. Hermione said after a moment of recollection. Exactly, the trapdoor. The fact that the three-headed dog was guarding it proves that there's something hidden underneath, and that something is likely what Dumbledore is trying to protect. The dog is there to guard it, Harry said with a face full of "I figured it out," speaking with utmost seriousness. Chapter 3-4 I confess. So what you mean is, Snape wanted to take whatever the three-headed dog was guarding, and then got bitten. Yep, judging by the size, it was probably the three-headed dog. But it didn't go deep enough, maybe because his pants were too thick. Or it could have been some sort of protection, Neville added. Oh, is that so? Harry looked a bit embarrassed. But I remember Professor Kasenhis also mentioned he knocked that three-headed dog out. Maybe that trapdoor was just a coincidence. Hermione frowned. Maybe Professor Kasenhis is one of the guardians of whatever is down there, and he was checking on it. Neville suggested. Why don't we just go ask Professor Kasenhis directly? What do you all think? This is why you came to see me. Kasenhis poured tea for the four young wizards in front of him. Because last time it was green tea, and it really was a bit bitter. Yes. Snape definitely has a problem. Harry said earnestly. Relax, he doesn't have a problem. And, a bit of respect, Professor Snape, if you're going to refer to him. All right, Professor Snape absolutely has a problem. Just because of that wound? I can explain. The mechanisms guarding that thing are a series of traps, set up by several professors, including me, Snape, Professor McGonagall, and others. At that time, Snape and I were adjusting one of the mechanisms we designed together, and he accidentally got bitten by the three-headed dog. And not because of some conspiracy theory you've come up with. The four kids fell silent, but Harry quickly seized on a new lead. Then, Professor, what about the protective enchantments on the Quidditch balls and our brooms that were erased? Who did that? I know I have a hunch, but I can't say. Because if that person finds out you're investigating him, he would really kill someone. He? So it's a man. And Professor Kasenhis, you've already said it's not Snape. That narrows it down a lot, there aren't many suspects. Hermione quipped after sipping her tea. This whole thing is because Dumbledore, in all his wisdom, decided it was a good idea. Honestly, I've always disagreed with these absurd schemes. In any case. Forget it, Dumbledore, ugh. It's Dumbledore. Times 4. What? No, where did you even get that idea? Kasenhis looked at them with a bewildered expression. Oh, okay, then, they muttered. What I'm saying is, it's not Dumbledore. I'm just mad at Dumbledore for letting a dark wizard run loose in Hogwarts and doing nothing about it, so I was venting. As for the actual dark wizard, honestly, instead of letting you investigate blindly, I might as well just tell you so you can keep your distance, Kasenhis said. But he knew full well that telling these audacious Gryffindor kids to steer clear of a dark wizard was pointless. They'd only become more determined to investigate recklessly. Still, given that their esteemed headmaster Dumbledore had already decreed, justice will triumph over evil, and that Voldemort must be defeated by Harry, it was inevitable Harry would confront Quirrell or Voldemort. So, Kasenhis decided to drop a small hint, a precautionary measure. At least it might prevent them from running out of leads and resorting to asking Quirrell directly like, Professor Quirrell, is there a dark wizard at Hogwarts? Do you know who it is? That would be ridiculous. Damn prophecies, what nonsense. Quirinus Quirrell, he said plainly. Professor Quirrell? The guy who stammers through every lecture and reeks of garlic. Ron was the first to object. I'm afraid it's him, Kasenhis replied with a shrug. But Professor Quirrell is, well, like that. Hermione frowned. Professor, are you sure you're not just making this up to throw us off? Do bad guys have bad guy written on their faces? Just like me, if I didn't tell you, would you know that I have to eat 4 little wizards every day to maintain my youthful appearance? Cassen said, almost looking like a mastermind villain of a children's story. Ron's mouth was agape and Neville shuddered. All right, I know that joke was terrible, Kasenhis admitted, rubbing the back of his head. Ptbahaha, actually, it was kind of funny, Professor. Coming from you, it's just funny, Harry said, his mouth twitching to suppress his laugh while Hermione exhaled the breath she didn't know she was holding. Forget the joke, Kasenhis replied with a wave of his hand. You just need to know that Quirrell isn't a good person. Stay far away from him, got it? But I still don't get it. Professor Quirrell, the way he is, what bad things could he even do? Ron asked, frowning. Oh, plenty. For example, remember the troll that got into the castle during the Halloween feast? Guess who let it in? Kasenhis raised an eyebrow. Bloody hell. That was Quirrell. Now that I've told you this, I'm asking you to promise me one thing. Right now, Dumbledore is handling the situation. There's no need for you first-year kids to get involved. So, I'm begging you when you're not in class, stay as far away from Quirrell as possible. Kasenhis implored earnestly. But I still don't get it, Ron said, staring at the dark oak ceiling. Anyone at Hogwarts seems more likely than Quirrell, even Filch, that old codger. At least with him, I can feel the murderous intent in his voice when he talks to me. If you want specifics, ask your brothers the Weasley twins. Ask them what Quirrell was like before and what he's like now. See if they know why someone who was once a proactive and upstanding wizard turned into the peculiar person he is today. Kasenhis suggested, giving them a potential lead. We will, Professor, Neville said with determination. You might, or at least I hope you will, Kasenhis sighed. After seeing the 4 kids off, Kasenhis sat on his sofa for a while, finishing the remaining tea in the pot. Then he got up and left his office, heading straight to the headmaster's office. Lemon sherbet, he said. The 2 stone gargoyles outside the office shifted aside, revealing the entrance. Inside, Dumbledore had already prepared 2 cups of green tea. Dumbledore, knowing Kasenhis didn't like sweet things, refrained from making his usual sugary red tea. Thanks for being considerate of my preferences, Kasenhis said, taking a sip of the tea. You're welcome. So, what brings you here? Dumbledore asked. It's about Harry and his friends. They figured out there's a dark wizard inside Hogwarts. After coming to me for answers, I decided to tell them the truth in hopes of stopping them from doing something reckless that might backfire, Kasenhis explained. You told them the truth. I spilled the beans about Quirrell, Kasenhis confessed bluntly. Chapter 35 European Alchemy Association's Evening Banquet. This is me playing a mod pack, and this is its crafting table recipe. I'm not sure if I should say what I'm thinking. In that case, let them go. Cassen left the headmaster's office, and those words were Dumbledore's answer. In response, he implicitly gave Dumbledore a slowly raised middle finger. Let them be typical of Dumbledore's personality. Go with the flow. Kasenhis had no objections to that approach. No objections, indeed. However, that didn't mean he couldn't have his own thoughts, his own little plans. Dumbledore could handle the grand strategy. Kasenhis respected the wisdom that came with the man's century-plus of life. He wouldn't argue with that. But within a certain range, Kasenhis figured he could enact some harmless, small-scale operations. And if those actions just so happened to trip up Quirrell on his path of mischief, all the better. Even Dumbledore couldn't stop that kind of thing. The last physical attack caused devastating damage to Quirrell. With Madame Pomfrey's healing skills, Quirrell had only needed a week before being discharged from the hospital wing. But this time, Kasenhis decided to up the ante. Unfortunately, now wasn't the time. Kasenhis was busy organizing his 7th-year students for the European Alchemy Association's evening banquet. Their research on iron golems had yielded results even earlier than the 4th year's work on the enchanting table. Every wizard listed as a CO author on the research paper had been invited to tomorrow night's awards ceremony, which doubled as a banquet in their honor. By Black Lake at dusk, Kasenhis stood wearing a light blue wizard's robe, shimmering with magical ripples that mimicked the surface of water. He meticulously inspected the appearance of the dozen or so 7th-year students before him, even though they were no longer children. "Cassie, where's your brooch? And your sleeve, there's a loose thread. Please pull it off. After tonight's banquet, we're taking a group photo together. That photo will appear in the next issue of Alchemy Journal and the Daily Prophet. Show some care, please." As he spoke, a graceful and elegant brooch appeared in his hand. He handed it to Cassie. "Ah, yes, Professor." Cassie hurriedly pulled off the loose thread and took the brooch with both hands, pinning it to her chest. "Mars, your shoes, look at them. Dull and lifeless. Is that acceptable? And right, your collar. If you think it's uncomfortable the way it is, just flip it out. Your shirt and jacket can absolutely work like that. Has no one ever told you?" After fine-tuning the students' outfits, Kasenhis glanced at his watch, then raised his head and continued speaking. "It's unfortunate that you're already in your 7th year. If time weren't so tight, I would have let you work on a project with more substantial value. But you're running out of time. I could only provide the iron golem, a somewhat rudimentary alchemical creation, as your 7th-year gift. However, your names, which you personally signed on this thesis, might make your futures much smoother. Since I've only had 1 year to teach you, this is the best I can do to make it up to you. Now, take a deep breath. In 1 minute, you'll be heading to the Ministry of Magic's banquet hall. There, the leading scholars of alchemy, reporters from the Daily Prophet, and high-ranking ministry officials will all be waiting for you. Pull yourselves together, ladies and gentlemen, for your own futures." Kasenhis said solemnly. "We will, Professor," replied one student. It was unclear whether it was due to hearing how much effort Kasenhis had put into their futures or the regret of only encountering such a professor in their 7th year, but their voice carried a rare hint of a sob. "Cassie, control your emotions. For the sake of making a good impression later, do you need to touch up your makeup?" Kasenhis asked, stepping over to the young witch and offering her a handkerchief. Cassie shook her head as she wiped her tears, discreetly pocketing the handkerchief. "As long as you're happy," Kasenhis said with a resigned shrug after witnessing the scene. Soon, the time came. Kasenhis pulled out a pouch filled with port keys that had been delivered to him in advance. "One for each of you. Ladies and gentlemen, watch your demeanor. This term is almost over. I can no longer teach you much more, but fortunately, I can still guide you through this evening, or perhaps, ensure your success, so to speak." Kasenhis distributed the port keys one by one. When he handed one to Cassie, the sentimental young witch suddenly gave him a spontaneous hug. All right, I hope this makes you happy," Kasenhis said, patting her on the back in a comforting manner. "I will do my best, Professor," Cassie replied. Soon, everyone had a porte-clés in hand. As the designated time arrived, they all, including Kasenhis, felt the strange pull of spatial magic, transporting them to a grand and luxurious venue. Thanks to the power of the Ender Pearl he had infused within himself, Kasenhis had teleported countless times in his office within just a few minutes, far more than most would in a lifetime. Thus, when he appeared at the venue, he immediately regained his composure, his posture immaculate. The students who had accompanied him didn't share his level of poise but remembered Kasenhis's advice: maintain decorum, maintain elegance. Thankfully, none of them embarrassed themselves. They were doing great. Before long, Kasenhis noticed several reporters with magical cameras slung around their necks approaching. He instinctively gestured to the students standing behind him to gather. Soon enough, a perfectly arranged group photo was captured by one of the reporters' cameras. "Damn! Excellent photography skills," Kasenhis remarked as he examined the dynamic photo captured by the reporter. Ensuring that everyone maintained their composure, with no closed eyes, yawns, or dazed expressions, he genuinely extended his hand for a handshake with the reporter. "Professor, what should we do next?" A student suddenly appeared at Kasenhis's right rear and asked in a low voice. "Remain composed, observe the situation, think of yourself as an established teacher when they ask questions, conquer them with confidence." The next day, Kasenhis looked at the front page of the latest Daily Prophet, where a clear photo of him and his students was prominently displayed. The headline was crafted with impeccable elegance, showering both Kasenhis and his students with praise. The overly flattering words of admiration even made Kasenhis blush slightly. He. Well, this is a bit embarrassing. Chapter 36 Challenged to a Duel. It had been some time since the Alchemy Gala, and nearly all of Hogwarts was still buzzing with admiration for the 7th-year alchemy students who had stolen the spotlight. However, amidst the excitement, there were those who noticed subtler things like Harry. He couldn't help but observe that ever since their visit to Professor Kasenhis's office, where they learned the truth about the hidden dark wizard in Hogwarts being none other than the timid and stuttering Professor Quirrell, the atmosphere had shifted. Whenever Professor Kasenhis and Professor Quirrell were in the same vicinity, there was a peculiar tension, a powder keg just waiting for a spark. Maybe it was just his imagination, but I just feel like Professor Kasenhis is constantly picking on Quirrell, every single time they're in the same space, Harry whispered to his 4 companions in the library. Of course he is. A strong wizard like Professor Kasenhis, who despises evil, is naturally going to act that way toward a dark wizard. It's only normal, Neville chimed in. Yes, we all understand that, Hermione responded while scribbling notes for her essay. But what worries me is that if Professor Kasenhis keeps targeting Quirrell like this, what if one day Quirrell can't take it anymore and tries to assassinate him? Professor Kasenhis is incredibly powerful. Did you forget? He blew up that troll with just one move. You didn't see the mess that day? Troll bits everywhere. Neville countered immediately, defensive of Kasenhis's abilities. Of course, I'm not saying Professor Kasenhis isn't strong. But what if Quirrell uses some sort of sinister curse or dark magic? Hermione argued back. Actually, Professor Kasenhis knows dark magic too. I remember when he saved Hagrid from some dark wizards in Nocturne Alley. He used some kind of skull spell to kill those 3 dark wizards, Harry added. That's not dark magic. How could Professor Kasenhis possibly use dark magic? Neville protested. But it was a skull, Harry countered. That still doesn't mean it's dark magic. Harry sighed, defeated by Neville's stubbornness. He wasn't sure how to argue further. Weren't we originally talking about Professor Kasenhis always picking on Quirrell? How did we end up on dark magic? Ron suddenly joined the conversation, looking utterly baffled. Meanwhile, Kasenhis remained blissfully unaware of the whispered debates about him in the library. However, their questions were soon to be answered, though not in the way they might have expected. During lunch in the Great Hall, just as Professor Quirrell was finishing his meal and preparing to leave, Kasenhis also stood up simultaneously. The two collided head-on. Kasenhis, of course, remained perfectly composed. Quirrell, on the other hand, toppled over and landed flat on his backside with an audible thud. For a brief moment, Quirrell's facade cracked. Not long ago, the same impeccably dressed Professor Kasenhis had been quite cordial toward him in the professor's lounge. Why, since that fateful Halloween night, had Kasenhis suddenly started behaving like a completely different person? Well, not entirely different. He was still kind and friendly toward other professors, the students, even Hagrid and Filch. But toward Quirrell? It was an entirely different story. The animosity was clear. Kasenhis treated everyone with kindness and respect, except for Quirrell. Burning with anger, Quirrell pulled a handkerchief from his pocket so quickly that even the Voldemort on the back of his head didn't have time to react. I challenge you to a duel. Kasenhis tilted his head, nonchalantly catching the handkerchief as it floated lazily toward him. Name a time. Tonight, in the Great Hall. In front of everyone, I'll defeat you. Quirrell shouted, his fury making him momentarily lose his usual stammer. The Voldemort behind him remained silent, seemingly curious to use this opportunity to gauge the skill of this rising alchemy professor. "Oh, no stuttering this time?" "Sure, your call." "Set up the stage and send someone to fetch me," Kasenhis replied, casually tucking the handkerchief into his pocket. "Humph. Dumbledore, I would like to request you as the arbiter of this duel." Quirrell quickly reverted to his usual stammer, casting a pleading look at Dumbledore, who was calmly sipping a glass of lemonade. "Oh, well, if that's the case, of course, I'd be happy to oblige," Dumbledore responded with an easy smile, readily agreeing. "Tonight, in the Great Hall, before dinner. I'll be there waiting for you." Quirrell glared at Kasenhis, his bloodshot eyes filled with rage. Kasenhis replied with a shrug, as if utterly unbothered by Quirrell's theatrics. Inwardly, however, he was already deliberating whether to give Quirrell a little educational talk he had learned while playing online games, during the duel. But in the end, Kasenhis decided against saying anything, knowing that with so many young witches and wizards around, setting a bad example wouldn't be ideal. Still, while he didn't speak, his actions conveyed everything he needed to express. In a motion as swift as lightning and as imposing as the sudden rise of Mount Everest, Kasenhis raised a single, sharp middle finger into the air. The gesture spoke volumes. Satisfied with his silent retort, Kasenhis turned and strode out of the Great Hall. The commotion quickly died down, leaving Quirrell seething as he stormed back to his defense against the Dark Arts office in a rage. "I knew this day might come, but I didn't expect it to arrive so soon," Neville mumbled through a mouthful of bread, his words barely intelligible. "I can't take this. I'm going to Professor Cassen office," Harry declared after a mere 2.5 seconds of contemplation, bolting out of his seat and toward the staircase by the side of the hall. "Wait for us." Neville hurriedly dropped his half-eaten bread. Hermione sighed, picking up Neville's forgotten remembrall and the homework he needed to submit that afternoon. Trailing behind them was Ron, clutching 2 chicken drumsticks in his hands. He claimed they were meant as a snack for Professor Kasenhis, just in case he was still hungry. Of course, that excuse might have held more weight if Ron hadn't already taken 2 bites out of each drumstick. When the 4 young wizards arrived at Kasenhis' office, they found themselves confronted with an unexpected problem. The office was already packed to the brim with students. Even the hallway outside was crowded, filled with third-year and older students jostling for space. The 4 houses' students had never been so unified in their determination to cram into a single space. Ron, ever observant, spotted his twin brothers near the doorway. "Professor Kasenhis." "Professor. Just say the word, and we promise Quirrell won't step out of his office," one of the twins shouted enthusiastically. "Professor. The twins are useless. Look at me. I can cast dark magic." Another voice chimed in. "Professor Kasenhis. I crafted an amazing alchemical artifact by hand. Guaranteed to give Quirrell an unforgettable alchemy shock. Professor Kasenhis, he dared to stand against you. I have a potion which'll make sure his thing never stands again. Professor Kasenhis. Are we even going to fit in there?" Ron muttered, wiping his grease-slicked mouth, his eye twitching uncontrollably at the chaotic scene. Chapter 37 Ohoha. "Are we still going in?" Hermione looked at the overwhelming crowd that could terrify even the most mild-mannered introvert and asked hesitantly. "Of course, we're going in," Harry declared, charging into the throng, using his small frame to push his way through. Neville wasn't about to be outdone. Though his build was sturdier than Harry's, it wasn't much help against the third years in the crowd he just couldn't push through. Meanwhile, inside the office, Professor Kasenhis, in an effort to maintain order, had no choice but to stand atop his desk. Honestly, if it weren't for this mess, he wouldn't have realized just how popular he was among the students. Everyone, listen to me. Please, listen to me. I'm deeply touched by your enthusiasm for coming here. But please trust me. I don't need dual assistants, stand-ins, or anyone to go sneaking around and assassinate Professor Quirrell in his office. Believe me, I can handle this on my own, all right." The students inside the office and those packed in the hallway gradually quieted down. Finally, after Kasenhis's heartfelt, almost desperate pleas, they relented and left his poor, overcrowded office. A little while later, only Kasenhis and the 4 students remained in the now quiet office. "I hope you're not here to help me assassinate Quirrell," Kasenhis said, raising an eyebrow. "Of course not, Professor. Hermione quickly clarified. Yeah, even if we had the idea, we wouldn't have the ability to pull it off, Harry added with an awkward laugh. I sincerely hope you don't even entertain such thoughts, Kasenhis said firmly. Oh, we won't. By the way, Professor, are you confident about the duel? Harry asked. Fairly confident, I'd say. Honestly, this is something I've been wanting as well. If Quirrell hadn't challenged me today, I would have done it myself. After all, letting him roam freely in the castle is a potential danger. If I can use this duel to confine him to the hospital wing, it's a small but meaningful contribution to Hogwarts' safety. So, Professor, you're pretty sure about this, hey? Neville chimed in. More or less. The duel came quickly. From the moment Quirrell threw down the challenge, well, technically, he threw a handkerchief since he didn't have gloves, to the moment they stood on the dueling platform, only half an hour had passed. At precisely 2 p.m., the Great Hall transformed. A dueling platform appeared in the center, with Kasenhis and Quirrell standing on opposite ends, each holding their wand pointed at their chest. In the middle of the platform stood Snape, who addressed both the duelists and the gathered students, explaining the significance and rules of the duel. When he finished, he instructed the two to bow to one another. The situation had escalated this far, so both Kasenhis and Quirrell bowed to each other. It was, after all, a Hogwarts duel, not a WWE match. There was no pre-fight trash-talking or rage-inducing theatrics here. After the two bowed, they turned simultaneously and walked toward their respective ends of the platform. At Snape's signal, they spun around in unison to face each other again. Quirrell was the first to act. He slashed his wand upward and shouted, "Serpent Sortia!" A massive serpent, over 4 meters long, suddenly appeared, slithering rapidly toward Kasenhis. Kasenhis, however, casually waved his wand. Flames, pixelated and flickering, crawled across the snake's entire body in an even spread. Without missing a beat, he sidestepped, letting the serpent's fiery form tumble off the platform below. With that, Kasenhis shrugged at Quirrell, raising his hands in a gesture that could only be described as the universal "really" expression. That's it. It's not over yet, Quirrell snapped, his wand darting downward. A trail of earthen spikes erupted from the ground, rushing toward Kasenhis's feet. Unfazed, Kasenhis scratched his chin thoughtfully, then tapped his wand lightly. In an instant, the entire dueling platform transformed into a sleek surface of obsidian. The spikes, their roots severed and their magic nullified, crumbled into dust upon hitting the ground. Kasenhis admired his work briefly, only to look up and find Quirrell casting yet another spell. This time, a silent incantation sent a streak of red light hurtling toward him. Judging by Quirrell's general vibe, Kasenhis couldn't immediately tell if it was a harmless disarming charm or the more sinister stupefy. Of course, there was an even greater possibility this was a bone-breaking curse. Kasenhis wasn't about to take chances. He skipped the theatrics, didn't even bother with his wand this time, and simply waved his hand upward. A black obsidian wall sprang up, absorbing the curse but shattering into shards upon impact. But Quirrell wasn't done. Barely a moment passed before another spell surged forth. A blazing red dragon of fire barreled straight toward Kasenhis. Snape, seeing the cursed fiend fire conjured by Quirrell, immediately leapt off the platform and turned to Dumbledore with alarm etched across his face. Dumbledore, however, merely waved a hand dismissively, gesturing for Snape to relax. He even seemed intrigued, as if watching an experiment unfold. Meanwhile, on the platform, Kasenhis wasn't quite as composed as Dumbledore. Although his face betrayed no concern, the fiery monstrosity in front of him was clearly no ordinary flame. One hand held his wand, while the other gripped a shimmering orb of water he had summoned. In his mind's eye, the dueling platform was overlaid with a grid of transparent cubes, marked by a three-dimensional axis. What he needed was simple: in one instant, he would fill every cube within that grid with water blocks and make sure none of them flowed. This instantaneous spatial compression would essentially rob the fiend fire of its existence, eliminating its occupied space. To put it simply, the water blocks would overwrite the cursed fire, like a program overwriting corrupted data. No more thinking. Time to act. Kasenhis watched as the massive fiery dragon grew larger and larger, nearly touching the ceiling of the Great Hall. With one hand, he tossed the summoned water source block into the corner of the room. With the other hand, he aimed his wand at a specific point on the Hogwarts ceiling. Instantly, an enormous cube of water materialized between the two duelists. The previously all-consuming fire dragon vanished without a trace. With the dragon extinguished, Kasenhis hadn't forgotten his original goal. From provoking Quirrell to accepting this duel, it was all for one reason, to ensure the man spent several days confined to the hospital wing. But just days. Dumbledore had made sure to telepathically remind him before the duel began, under no circumstances could Quirrell lose his life. That single restriction meant he couldn't use his wither skeleton skulls. And while a TNT blast would make for a flashy spectacle, it was far too mild to achieve the desired outcome of ensuring Quirrell stayed bedridden. Fortunately, in his time at Hogwarts, Kasenhis had made quite a favourable impression on both students and faculty. This was his moment to cash in on that goodwill. End crystal. Kasenhis waved his wand lightly. A hovering purple cube, surrounded by shimmering violet outlines, appeared in midair. The moment the end crystal materialized, it shot toward Quirrell with astonishing speed. Boom! The explosion sent Quirrell flying across the platform. He landed with a resounding thud, motionless but very much alive. The great hall fell into a stunned silence. A moment later. Oh ho 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 ha! Chapter 38 Home Visit. Kasenhis stepped off the dueling platform and approached the unconscious Quirrell sprawled on the ground. After confirming that the man would likely be confined to the hospital wing for at least 1 to 2 weeks, he finally relaxed and withdrew his gaze. As for the missing defense against the dark arts classes, he was confident there was someone who would be more than happy to take over. Back in his office, Kasenhis did something rare. He pulled a bottle of champagne from his cabinet and made his way toward Hagrid's hut. The next day, Hagrid was up early, holding a bundle of red ribbons as he left his hut. With Christmas just around the corner, even though it was unclear why wizards celebrated the holiday, the festive spirit called for a Christmas tree. To the pine trees in the Forbidden Forest, however, those red ribbons were a death sentence. Once marked, a tree's days were numbered. It was, quite simply, tragic. Unlike Hagrid, Kasenhis had no morning errands. With no classes to teach, he strolled leisurely back to the castle and to his office, greeting every student he passed with warmth and cheer. Once inside, he picked up the attendance roster and a sheet of parchment. One by one, he began preparing Christmas gifts for each student. When everything was ready, all that was left to do was wait. Wait for Christmas. Who? Kasenhis stood at the Hogsmeade station, observing the Hogwarts Express for the first time. He found the idea of a wizarding train imitating a Muggle locomotive quite intriguing. After all, a train powered by magic theoretically wouldn't need to produce smoke. With the ticket Dumbledore had given him in hand, Kasenhis stepped onto the train. According to the headmaster, since the invention of the Hogwarts Express, nearly every young witch and wizard had ridden it. Kasenhis, however, had missed out on this experience since he hadn't attended the school as a student. Dumbledore had gone out of his way to secure him a ticket so he could enjoy the novelty of the ride. Of course, riding the train wasn't purely for leisure. Having packed up all his belongings from the Muggle world and moved them to Hogwarts, Kasenhis planned to spend the Christmas holiday at the school. This trip was more about making house calls and delivering gifts to his Muggle friends. One stop in particular was the Longbottom residence. Kasenhis suspected that Neville's reserved nature stemmed from the overwhelming influence of his strong-willed grandmother. He had considered writing her a letter but found himself overwhelmed every time he tried. Letter writing wasn't his forte. He always struggled to figure out what to say. He much preferred face-to-face conversations. Sitting down with a cup of hot tea and some not too sweet yet fragrant pastries was far more his style. He relished showcasing the art of conversation. Thus, the house call to the Longbottom family was born. That said, he opted not to sit in the same compartment as Neville. Even though Harry and Ron were staying at Hogwarts over Christmas, leaving compartments with open seats, Kasenhis chose not to join them. Being a professor, he felt it would be awkward for Neville if they sat together for the entire ride. After all, making house calls like this was already quite intrusive. Time passed, and eventually, the train pulled into the Muggleside station, platform 934 at King's Cross. Kasenhis stepped off the train and quickly spotted the highly recognizable witch Professor McGonagall had described. She was an elderly woman dressed in an intricately detailed wizarding robe, wearing a large, moss-green witch's hat, her expression stern. Everything about her radiated authority. Kasenhis thought she must have a close relationship with McGonagall after all, their temperaments were uncannily similar, even if their fashion sense diverged. Where this woman leaned toward extravagance, McGonagall favored simplicity. Professor Hiss, I am Augusta Longbottom, Neville's grandmother. That boy has written me enough letters to fill a trunk, all about you. Thank you for taking care of that poor child, Augusta said as she approached. She had noticed Kasenhis's towering presence amidst the sea of students. Kasenhis. Just Cassen is fine, Mrs. Longbottom, Kasenhis replied warmly. I came primarily to discuss Neville's personality. That child's been causing you trouble? Augusta asked, her brow furrowing. No, absolutely not, Kasenhis quickly reassured her, waving his hands. Not trouble at all. In fact, the boy is too obedient, too well behaved. He's so quiet and reserved it's hard to believe he's in Gryffindor. Ah, I see, that boy's always been like that. Too timid. I always thought he belonged in Hufflepuff, Augusta replied, nodding in agreement. Kasenhis nodded and was about to respond when a rapid patter of footsteps interrupted him. Neville came running over, his face flushed from exertion. Neville. Professor Cassen. Professor, would you care to join us for a meal at Longbottom Manor? Augusta asked. Of course, just a simple meal, Kasenhis replied with a nod. Augusta took Neville's small hand in her left and placed her right hand on Kasenhis's shoulder. In the next moment, the three of them appeared on a secluded island. Kasenhis gazed at the distant, grand yet understated manor with its classical design. If I were to renovate this place. He quickly shook off the intrusive thought. This was no time for his usual whims about construction projects. Longbottom Manor now had only 2 permanent residents, plus Kasenhis as an outsider for the day. Of course, Kasenhis didn't know how many other Longbottom family members there might be in total, nor did he see a need to inquire. He was here for a house visit, not to conduct a census. At least for today, the expansive manor seemed to house just the 3 of them, discounting the house elves quietly working in unseen corners. This also gave Kasenhis a clearer understanding of the level of authority Augusta Longbottom wielded. Owning such a grand manor, how could she not be strong-willed? Without a forceful personality, she would have long been taken advantage of by distant relatives who appear out of nowhere, ready to exploit her wealth. After all, while the wizarding world has the Ministry of Magic, its efficiency is questionable at best. They are excellent at catching wizards performing tricks in the Muggle world, whether it's cooking, magic shows, or renovation, but when it comes to dealing with true crimes like murder and arson, they suddenly become as silent as the grave. The 3 first sat in the parlor, though calling it 3 was a stretch. Neville had barely asked if he could stay and listen when Augusta shot him a look, and he obediently retreated to his room. Please, go ahead, Professor Kasenhis. What you just did is precisely what I wanted to discuss, Mrs. Longbottom. Your forceful demeanor has left the boy gasping for air. As a Gryffindor, he has already lost much of the courage that should define him under such pressure. Kasenhis adopted the same mindset and eloquence he had used when negotiating with unreasonable clients during his brief foray into the renovation world. He was prepared to exhaust every ounce of his verbal skill to make his point. Unexpectedly, Augusta didn't respond like those insufferable clients, stubbornly defending her methods. Instead, she sighed and nodded in acknowledgement. I am, of course, aware of all this. But, to be frank, it's not that I doubt Neville's potential, it's just that he never seems to do anything right. Chapter 39 Christmas Gifts. Afterward, Kasenhis was subjected to nearly an hour of stories recounting Neville's various embarrassing incidents from birth until he started attending school. In a way, this was a vicious cycle. Why was it a vicious cycle? Well, Neville's magical aptitude was slightly lackluster, which provoked dissatisfaction among the Longbottom family. To force Neville to demonstrate his magical talent, the family implemented all sorts of high-pressure tactics. These high-pressure methods, in turn, hurt Neville's psyche, a significant problem for a wizard trying to perform magic without confidence. And so, Neville and the Longbottom family members became entangled in a cycle of mutual harm, leaving both sides in pain. Yet, no one could clearly identify the fault. The Longbottom family wanted their heir to demonstrate magical talent, nothing wrong with that. Neville, as a child, couldn't be blamed for being a bit slower in developing his abilities. In fact, he wasn't even truly lacking in talent, his issue stemmed from a lack of confidence. And this lack of confidence? Kasenhis carefully reviewed the entire situation, retracing every step, until he finally identified the primary culprits. Voldemort and his Death Eaters. That's right, the root cause of Neville's current predicament lay squarely at their feet. Having figured out this key point, Kasenhis felt a sudden clarity and freed himself from the trap of overthinking. Dinner was soon prepared and served by the house elves, and Kasenhis glanced at the spread, once again marveling at the resources of these old pure-blood families. In Hogwarts, such a feast was typically shared among the entire staff. However, tonight, a meal rivaling or even exceeding Hogwarts dinner was prepared for just the three of them. The meal proceeded pleasantly, with both the host and guest enjoying themselves. Yet Kasenhis couldn't help but notice that whenever Neville looked at his grandmother, the same unintentional withdrawal and timidity appeared on his face. At the table, Kasenhis deliberately recounted to Augusta the story of how Neville, unburdened by the presence of his formidable grandmother, managed to knock the Malfoy heir flat with just his wand, a tale embellished with a touch of artistic liberty. His intention was to illustrate to Augusta that when not stifled by her imposing presence, Neville could excel, particularly in areas like dueling and herbology. "I will follow your advice, Professor Kasenhis. Encouragement-based education," Augusta said as she walked Kasenhis to the gates of the manor. Neville trailed behind her, clearly wanting to accompany them further, beyond the limits of the manor's anti-apparition wards. "This is far enough," Kasenhis said, smiling. "It doesn't have to be strictly encouragement-based education. Normal education works just fine, as long as it's not suppressive. Speaking of normal education, I'd actually recommend taking a page out of the Weasley family's book, specifically the Weasleys from the Burrow." "I'll make time to visit the Burrow," Augusta replied thoughtfully. "Not this Christmas, though. I believe they're visiting one of their older sons," Kasenhis added. "Professor, are you sure you won't stay for at least a day?" "Just one day?" Neville asked hesitantly, standing behind his grandmother. "I'm sorry, but honestly, I'm quite busy this Christmas," Kasenhis explained. "When I return to Hogwarts, there's still so much work waiting for me. The fourth year's enchanting table thesis has been approved, and I need to find time to take them to receive their well-deserved accolades. Not to mention my office renovation and expansion plans, and the Christmas gifts for all of you. While I've prepared them, I haven't packed them yet, let alone added the cards and sent them off." "You prepared a lot, didn't you?" Neville asked. "Of course. Aside from gifts for all of you, I've also prepared presents for the professors and my Muggle friends. I still need to go back to my previous residence outside the school to collect their gifts. It's an endless cycle, truly exhausting," Kasenhis said with a chuckle. "Well, all right then," Augusta said. Kasenhis nodded to both of them. With a sudden rumbling sound, he disappeared from where he stood, leaving behind faint, purple glowing particles that gradually faded into the air. "Professor Kasenhis can bypass the anti-apparition enchantments? And that wasn't the magic of a portkayat?" Augusta murmured in astonishment. "Nothing Professor Kasenhis does surprises me anymore. The other day, he even knocked Professor Quirrell straight into the medical wing with a single move," Neville chimed in. "Quirrell? That adept in dark magic?" Augusta asked, uncharacteristically using the word adept with a tinge of respect. "Is he really that powerful, Quirrell? He has quite the depth of skill. Among the younger generation, he's at least stronger than most Aurors," Augusta admitted, pulling Neville closer as they headed back into the manor. Returning to his residence at 222 Baker Street in London, Kasenhis chuckled helplessly as he glanced at the pile of Christmas cards crammed into his mailbox. Soon, he retrieved a large stack of Christmas gifts from the local post office. As he unwrapped them one by one, he prepared return gifts for each sender. "Let's see. Mrs. Marcia sent me, oh, something quite pink. Lovely," he muttered with amusement. "Peanut sent me a bag of peanuts. Lucky for me, I sent him peanuts too. Perfect match. And Sherlock's signed trench coat." Still as narcissistic as ever, Kasenhis remarked, shaking his head. He quickly found his sewing kit and covered Sherlock's embroidered name with a small patch of fabric. On the left collar, Kasenhis embroidered his own name. "Much better," he said, nodding in satisfaction at his handiwork. Trying on the newly modified trench coat, Kasenhis admired himself in the full-length mirror. He turned left, turned right, and even glanced out the window to check his neighbors' reactions. No one. Of course, those two were always so busy. After finishing the reciprocal gifts for his Muggle friends, Kasenhis blinked back to his alchemy office at Hogwarts. There, he carefully packed the stack of pre-prepared presents into his ender chest, ensuring every gift was safely stowed away for delivery. Kasenhis carried a small ender chest ring on his finger and made his way toward Hogwarts Alchemy. Unfortunately, the few days leading up to Christmas had already left the owls with barely any rest, and Kasenhis' arrival only worsened the situation for the overworked birds. "Alright, let's see. Harry's protective broomstick cover, this one I can just send directly to his dorm." Yes. Neville's memory bracelet. That remembrall is too big and he won't forget this bracelet, which will be tied to his hand. Ron's new robe. Seriously, can the Weasleys not even afford a new robe? Hermione's alchemy primer. If she chooses my course in her 3rd year, I'm definitely making her the class representative. Angelina's broomstick cushion. Professor McGonagall's enchanted quill. She'll love this. Severus, does Snape have a fear of hair conditioner or something? His hair is always so greasy. Lucky for him, he has a friend like me, a hair-drying machine. I'm a genius. Hagrid's golden beer mug. He's always complaining that his mugs are too light and don't feel substantial. Hopefully, he won't find my gift lacking in creativity. Are you struggling to lift it? Kasenhis asked as he secured Hagrid's gift to an owl. The poor owl, tasked with carrying the hefty mug, flapped its wings furiously but failed to take off. Chapter 40. A happy life is the most important. Cassen had no choice but to take out the enchanting table, applying a buoyancy enhancement to the owl's box. Only then could the poor creature wobble away with the gift securely in its talons. The last gift was for Dumbledore. Kasenhis had previously purchased 2 brand new pairs of wool socks in the Muggle world. He enchanted them with warmth spells using the table before carefully packaging them and sending them off with another owl to be delivered. The next day, Kasenhis woke up and eagerly began unwrapping his own presents. McGonagall had gifted him a Gryffindor lion brooch, noting his fondness for wearing brooches. Snape's gift, however, was a small vial of Felix Felicis. The moment Kasenhis held it, he regretted his choice of Snape's gift. Compared to the luxury of liquid luck, the dry hair cleaning machine he'd sent felt embarrassingly inadequate. Other gifts were mostly accessories Kasenhis frequently wore or items he found practical. But the gifts from Neville and Dumbledore stood out as particularly unique. Dumbledore had sent a book in advanced and incredibly complex treatise on alchemy. Neville, on the other hand, had given Kasenhis a set of dark red robes. They were so soft they felt like flowing water, with molten lava-like patterns that shimmered and emitted a comfortable warmth perfect for winter. However, the highlight of Kasenhis' Christmas was finally convincing Hagrid, after much cajoling, to let him renovate Hagrid's hut. That same day, Kasenhis bolted out of the Hogwarts castle, transporting Hagrid, his belongings, essentials, and sentimental items out of the hut in the blink of an eye. "Hagrid, are you sure there's nothing important left inside?" Kasenhis asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he turned to Hagrid. The half-giant scratched his head, glancing at the pile of items surrounding him. Nope, that's everything. And the dragon egg." "Got it." In the next moment, Kasenhis moved like lightning. An end crystal shot toward Hagrid's hut, and with a resounding boom, the hut vanished, leaving nothing but a large crater in the ground. "Wow, I remember you said it was just a little decoration," Hagrid said with some embarrassment. "Don't worry about the details, tell me what kind of new house you want." Kasenhis waved his hand dismissively. Not too big. But, you know, maybe a bit bigger than what I had. It should have a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen. Gotta have a kitchen. If you can add a bathroom, that'd be grand. And, make it cute." "No problem." Kasenhis pulled out his wand and got to work. Every flick of his wand caused the ground beneath them to disappear under the force of powerful magic. He began with the foundation. Several sturdy oak beams were sunk into the earth, each precisely cut and notched to fit snugly into one another. After stabilizing the support pillars, Kasenhis switched tactics, using his classic lava and water method to create a firm and durable base. Once the framework was in place, he began laying down spruce wood planks for the flooring. With the groundwork completed, Kasenhis motioned for Hagrid to step forward. "Come over here, Hagrid. Tell me what kind of spaces you need so I can design them properly." "Oh ho, really? Well, first, I'd like a fireplace." Could it be pink?" Hagrid asked hopefully. "Technically, yes. But no, I'm not making you a pink fireplace." "Oh, okay. Well, where's the door going to be?" "There," Kasenhis pointed to the north-facing part of the foundation, near the right support pillar. "I'll put in a 3-meter-high door so you'll never have to duck again when coming inside." "Oh. What comes after the door?" Hagrid was now behaving like a very curious child with stars in his eyes. A foyer, where you'd have a shoe rack, umbrella stand, coat hooks, that sort of thing. Oh, but no one visits me that much, can I skip the foyer? Hagrid asked earnestly. You can, but I wouldn't recommend it. It'd feel really odd, Kasenhis explained. Oh, all right, fine. And what comes after the foyer? Kasenhis was so distrustful of himself by Hagrid's series of questions that he answered in a strange tone, maybe it's the living room, don't you know this common sense? Hagrid's puppy eyes dimmed slightly after hearing that. Well, castles don't really bother with all those details, Professor Cassen. And I haven't been to many other places. Ah. Does no one invite him to their house? Fair enough. So, the foyer leads into the living room, standard and straightforward. Do you want a fireplace in the living room? Of course. Even if it's not pink. Hagrid beamed once more. Kasenhis nodded and moved to the back of the foundation. Using polished stone, he built a sturdy fireplace. Beneath it, he placed magma blocks, lighting a flame on top and securing the front with iron bars. But how will I add logs to the fire now? This fire won't go out, and if it ever does, there's this, Kasenhis explained as he pulled out a stone button and placed it beside the fireplace. Look here, press this once, and the fire goes out. Press it again, and it lights back up. Absolutely amazing. Hagrid marveled. Kasenhis added a coffee table in front of the fireplace, surrounding it with a row of sofas. He even included an extra-large, oversized sofa near the fireplace, custom-made for Hagrid's comfort. The kitchen and bathroom followed standard layouts, clean, organized, and functional until Kasenhis reached the staircase leading to Hagrid's first-floor bedroom. Even though the logic of Minecraft blocks defied real-world physics where theoretically, a thin wooden plank could support 10 Hagrids stacked on top without a problem, it still didn't sit well with Kasenhis. As a proud graduate of the University of Manchester's civil engineering program, Kasenhis found himself grappling with his professional instincts. While he understood the absurdity of physics in this world, his inner perfectionist and latent OCD couldn't accept it. So, he abandoned traditional flooring techniques using slabs and frames. Instead, he opted to stack solid blocks for structural support. This approach led to a tiny issue: Hagrid's first-floor flooring ended up a meter thick. To balance out the proportions, Kasenhis had to raise the ceiling height on the ground floor. Similarly, the first-floor ceiling was raised to maintain consistency. As for an attic? Nope. Kasenhis sealed off the roof completely. No attics. No unnecessary voids. Just clean, functional living space. Kasenhis stood in Hagrid's new bedroom, considering the space thoughtfully. After a moment, he broke through the window and constructed a protruding balcony, which doubled as a sunshade for the front door below. To ensure structural integrity, he added support pillars to the sunshade. Perfect, absolutely perfect, Kasenhis said, stepping back to admire his work. Elegant, so elegant, he continued, retreating further as he admired the entirely revamped Hagrid's hut. And then, he saw Hagrid carrying his dusty old belongings back into the pristine space. Suddenly, not quite so elegant anymore, is it? Dumbledore appeared behind Cassen at some point and said with a smile. Kasenhis merely shrugged. What matters most is that he's happy living in it.
Thanks for listening.